Where are you here?
Oh, there I am. Hey.
Where are you? Where?
Got me?
Oh boy. Yeah. Walk with me, Lord. Walk with me.
Come on, Dad.
Walk with me, Lord. Walk with me. All along this Jesus journey. Walk with me, Lord. Walk with me. Yeah.
Walk with my mama.
You walk with my mama.
Walk with me.
Walk with me too.
You walk with my mama.
Yeah.
Walk with me.
And walk with me too.
Oh, my.
Yeah.
Jesus
journey.
I want Jesus.
Want Jesus.
Walk with me.
Walk with me. Hold my hand, Lord. Hold my hand. Hold my hand, Lord. Hold my hand. All along this Jesus journey. Hold my hand, Lord. And hold my hand.
Walk with Moses.
You walk with Moses.
Walk with me.
Walk with me.
You walk with Moses. Walk with me.
Walk with me.
While I'm home.
Yeah. Jesus journey.
I want Jesus.
I want Jesus to walk with me.
Say, walk with me, Lord. How y'all doing?
Walk with me. Walk with me.
Lord. Walk with me.
Walk with me.
I'm on my
Yeah, Lord.
I want Jesus
I want Jesus
to walk with me.
to walk with
Go ahead,
me. Walk with David, a little shepherd boy.
That's the deal with that one.
Yeah, you made him a great king. I know David shouted for joy. He walked with David, and he's a little shepherd boy. You made him a great king. And David shouted for joy.
That's right.
Oh, yeah. So walk with me, Lord. Walk with me. Walk with me, Lord. Walk with me. All along this Jesus journey. Walk with me, Lord. Walk with me. You gotta walk with me, Lord.
Yeah! That was rocking great, brother.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure some of the people who have come together for this are thinking, what have I gotten myself into? We've got street musicians and dogs trying to get into the house. We've got B-roll with crazy music for the from a London double-decker bus. We have Michael Martin and Karen Wong already in studio, as it were. We are waiting for the rest of the group to. Okay, here's our fearless leader, Nate, and we'll have hopefully a couple more coming in soon. I should check my.
As far as I know, Graham was the only one who couldn't make it.
Okay, yeah. So we've still got a couple more coming. So welcome. What we are doing this morning for this Friday morning live stream is we are going to jumpstart our Encountering Face-to-Face conference that is coming up next month. Maybe before everybody's here, I'll have Nate talk about this, because Nate is the one who has organized this conference. And what were you thinking, Nate, in terms of putting this thing together?
So Sherry and I had kicked around the idea of doing a conference for a couple of years, but we never really, got a solid idea of what we wanted to do. And I actually got the nudge to actually do this actually came from Grim, kind of inadvertently. Like after Chad did his denim dinner, Grim started talking about me doing a barbecue event. And so I'm like, well, if I'm going to do a barbecue, Sherry and I have been talking about doing a conference for a long time. So why don't I just bake that into the idea of doing the conference? So that's what planted the seed. And I knew I wanted it to be estuary focus, because I think estuary is amazing. And I want more people to be able to experience it. So we created an estuary focus conference. It's officially called Estuary Northwest 2024 Encountering Face-to-Face, but has become unofficially known as Northwestuary because of Slack and my brother-in-law and Grim. So yeah, that's the short genesis.
All right. And before I give all of the participants here a chance to introduce themselves, why did you pick the participants that you picked, and how did you pick the topic?
Sure. So that's a great question. Actually, initially, I was thinking, like, when I first started thinking of the idea of doing a conference a couple of years ago, I was thinking about doing something like a theme that was going to be something like Myth versus the Machine. And I had this conversation with Ted, who I met in Chino a while back, which is actually one of my all-time, like, of all the conversations I've ever had on my channel, it's my favorite one. We had this really great conversation where we talked about food and poetry, and in the course of that conversation, I was developing this connection that I had begun seeing between the concept of witness and the poetic vocation, which I don't know if you remember, I did mention something about that at the event in DC, which Michael was also at. And so remembering, like, following that thread, I wanted to call it witnessing, but I didn't want people to get the wrong idea about what was meant by witnessing, to just think it was like an excuse to evangelize, because that's not what I was conceiving at all. And so I decided to call it Encountering Face-to-Face, which is directly connected to the idea of witness, but it sounds less like, Christian jargon. So that's how that was sort of the seed. And I knew I wanted Michael to be there right away. Michael and I have done a lot of fruitful things together. And Karen is part of the reason I even have a channel at all. I got my start on YouTube talking about Barfield on Karen's channel, and I knew that if I ever did anything, that I wanted Karen to be a part of it. I'd had a conversation with Rafe fairly not that long ago when I first started thinking about this. And I kind of, the impression I had from my conversation with the Rafe is that like there was a lot more left to be said, that it was like a very promising beginning of the conversation. And I knew I wanted a poet, and Sherry really, really strongly encouraged me to invite Graham to come. And Chris Green is just one of my favorite people. He's just he's one of my all-time favorite guests. He's been on Grail Country several times, and I knew if I did anything that I would want to involve him. And of course, Paul. I mean, none of us would be doing any of this if it wasn't for you. So you were an obvious choice. All right. That's the story.
All right. Well, let's get into introductions here, and I'm just going to play with StreamYard here and bring people into the big window. Michael Martin, how do you want to introduce yourself? You've now almost everybody here has been around the corner for a while, either participated or been on live streams of things or done events. So for those who know nothing about you, Michael, how do you want to introduce yourself for this space?
I've been around the block. That's where I've been. Well, I've kind of tangentially been hanging around for a few years, but I was a professor for many years and was a teacher before that. Lately my focus is two things. I have a farm. My wife and I run a biodynamic farm in Michigan, and but I've been doing a lot of writing over the years, and I've written a few books on sociology, and I've been doing a lot on the reimagination of Christianity, in particular on my Substack, which is called The Druid Stares Back. And so I'm a musician, so I have a lot going on. I'm old, so I've done a lot of stuff, and I also have a podcast I co-host with my friend Mike Sauter called The Regeneration Podcast, which some people might know about. But that's my and I'm a poet too. So this is, as Nate was saying, this is the subject matter is right up my alley, because I think everything I've done as an intellectual actually had its start in poetry and songwriting, and everything else is an outgrowth of that, and my understanding of our relationship to God is also heavily colored by what I would call poetic intuition.
Okay.
So there it is.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Karen. Now Karen, you are definitely a corner OG. When I started making videos, Karen was one of the first ones to find it, and she lives not too far away from me. And Karen, of course, started the Meaning Code. So I don't know what people need to know more about you than probably the audience already knows, Karen, but maybe give a little cursory summary of who you are and how you got into this space and why you said yes to this conference.
Well, you're why I got into this space, but I noticed that on the promo material, Nate bills me as the artist, and I will take that title only insofar as I am a human being, and I believe that all human beings are artists because we're made in the image of God, who is the great artist. So, but in my role as artist and kind of exploring the principles of creativity for about 20 years, it made me start thinking about the way that the cosmos is put together and the patterns and the principles that underlie it. And I started the channel basically to explore whether these thoughts that I had had for 20 years were completely insane or whether there was some validity. And to do that, I've had to talk to a lot of people from various domains of knowledge. And right now my brain is so stuffed full of stuff that trying to pump out a 15-minute talk for Nate is like impossible. I've started it 6 times and left it unfinished. So who knows what we'll get at the end of it.
Well, I'm sure it'll be great. I mean, you have been bringing together some of the most important people in many of these conversations and getting them talking together on your channel. So I'm really excited to hear what comes out of everything that you've been putting together now for the last 6 years. So welcome. Thank you, Karen. And this fella, Rafe Kelly. Rafe, at the art conference, I had a lot of time to spend with Rafe because both he and I got sick of listening to these plenary sessions, and so we'd sit out back and compare notes to the other people that we spoke with. Rafe, why don't you introduce yourself about what you do and why you think you're here and why you said yes to this thing? You're muted.
Sorry. I started becoming interested in discussions with Paul through our mutual interest in Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke's work, and I've essentially taken parkour and martial arts and various other things and started to ask the question of how a physical practice can give meaning in life and how it's connected to the things that help us cultivate our character and our wisdom, and then how it can be part of an ecology of practices along with dialogical and philosophical practices, mindfulness practices that can help us recover a sense of meaning. And so ultimately I've kind of come to this idea that there's the relationships that are internal to us, both the physical parts of us and the non-physical parts of us, the relationships that we have to the world as a landscape we move through, the relationship we have to the world as a set of tools that we can manipulate and work with, or toys, the relationship we have to other embodied agents, and the relationship to the transcendent. And that within physical practice, we have the capacity to enter into greater sophistication and growth and reciprocal opening in relationship to each of those connections that we have with the world. And that has been of interest, I guess, to people in this little corner of the internet as well. And so I've had lots of fun conversations, and as part of that, I've been dipping my toes in the waters of Christianity and figuring out what all that means to me. And that's been apparently interesting to many people. I'll end up here. Wow, that was loud.
It was loud. Yeah, they heard you. My daughter dropped something on the steps. Sorry.
All right. So, and Rafe just had a conversation with Karen on Karen's channel. And when I saw it, there were less than 100 views on that. I was really very surprised by that. So, yeah, if you haven't caught Rafe and Karen's conversation on the meaning code, you should check that out. And this is probably the newest guy to the corner. Chris and I had a conversation not very long ago, and that conversation has really haunted me. And I grabbed some stuff from that conversation that I certainly will bring to the event. And this I know for some people in the corner, Chris wearing a clerical collar is like a win, because people have been unable to persuade me to do it, even when some people have gone out and bought me clerical collars. I won't name names. But Chris, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us why you said yes to this crazy Northwest Estuary, which you probably only partially know what you're getting yourself into.
I never know what I'm getting myself into. This is, even more risky for me than most things are. But honestly, everything's a risk. I'm not a functional adult. And my wife is saying amen from the other room. It's Nate's to blame for me being here, for sure. Although at this point, I have had the chance to talk with Michael and with Paul. And I said yes because Nate's a trustworthy guy. And if he was inviting me, I don't think he would invite me into a space where I'd be eaten up and spit out. So showing up, I'm still working on my talk. I'm a kind of inveterate, hopeless re-editor. So the talk won't be finished until my 15 minutes are up. Like, that's how that's going to work. Priest and theologian, and trying to, get through every day without embarrassing myself or the Lord or anyone else too badly. So I'm looking forward to it. It seems like the kind of space, even though I am new to the corner, as you said, it seems like the kind of space where the kind of thinking I like to do is possible. So I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Good. Well, I am going to. When I thought about this, I asked Nate, do you have a plan for this? He said, no, not really. I said, okay, well, I've got a plan for it. And the plan was to do some estuary process here on the video itself. And some of you who've been watching my channel for a long time and who might be familiar with estuary might have an idea of what we're doing. Chad does this online sometimes. Estuaries are meeting all over the world right now. John Van Donk is actually over on his way to Europe, if not there already starting new estuary groups. And what we do is we sort of practice what I call, John Van Donk hates the name, the estuary protocol, which is just basically a way of starting a conversation, getting it off the ground. And so what we will do is I'm going to go around the table, as it were. I'm just going to go the order of the people in the blocks, at least the way I see them. I think on StreamYard, they're seen the same way all over. And each of you should put something on the table. Now, I think it would be nice if what you put on the table is connected to the talk you're thinking about giving at the Northwestuary. But it doesn't have to be, because usually with estuary, you have an opportunity to put something on the table. It can be something intellectual, something you've been thinking about or something you heard. It can be something contextual, something going on in your country, your city, your home, your school, your place of work. It can be something personal, something in your personal life that has happened that you would be willing to share, especially because most of the time estuary is in person and not recorded. And here we are recording this thing online. Or it can be something estuarial, something that has to do with estuary itself. And so I'm gonna have Nate start, because he very much knows how this goes. And Nate, what would you like to put on the table?
Well, okay. Well, I have been thinking a lot about the imagination. I just finished, last night was the last class of a class I've been taking from Paul Axton over at the Forging Plowshares Institute on imaginative apologetics. And I had to do my final presentation for that class. And I did it as, my topic was imagination and incarnation, imagination as a truth-bearing faculty in Blake, Coleridge, MacDonald, and Barfield. So that's what I've been thinking about, and I think that it is connected to the conference, because it's connected to this, especially the Barfield part, because my focal text for that was poetic diction, and so there's a connection between this idea of the poetic vocation as witness and the imagination, like strange incarnational properties.
Okay. I'm just taking notes like I always do at estuary meetings, because I can't always remember what everybody thinks. Michael, you teacher, professor, do you have an idea of the assignment I just gave you?
Yes. I've been thinking about faces a lot. And faces in scripture, but also in literature. So like C.S. Lewis's Until We Have Faces. So we get some kind of an interesting touchstone. It's been, I haven't really been actively, hashing it out, but I've been, kind of dwelling with it. But also, I think in a way he connects the myth of Psyche to St. Paul in 1 Corinthians with looking through the glass darkly, right? And then face to face. And also, I was thinking about one of my favorite books ever is Alice Through the Looking Glass. And one of the moments in there where I don't know how this is all going to fall together when I get to the talk, but it might not. When Alice is talking to Humpty Dumpty, and toward the end of the conversation, going, "Oh, well, let's see you again." He goes, "Well, I probably won't recognize you if I see you." Well, one usually goes by the face. And he says, "What's the problem? Your face is like everybody else's. Mouth on the bottom, eyes up above. Even if you had the mouth on the side and eyes over here, that might be helpful." But because it's about, and even what St. Paul's talking about is perception, right? The ability to perceive or the inability to perceive accurately. and plus I've been teaching a course on Christian romanticism, and one of the key texts for that or key thinkers is Jakob Burma, the Lutheran mystic, and a lot of what he talks about. I was just writing about this before we jumped on, writing an introduction for a book, and I was thinking about Burma's idea of God's wrath and God's love, these different worlds, and that the whole problem. The interesting thing is that it's about perception again, because or disposition, that the way we experience God could be through love and it could be through wrath, but usually, God being unchangeable. With the thing is, our state of sin or anxiety or whatever would make that the light of God's love blind us or feel like it's burning, because we're not in a condition to accept it, right? And I think that's part of what St. Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 13, about when we look through a glass darkly, but then face to face, right? Because the glass means a looking glass or a window, right? And that's what Alice through the looking glass, right? And it's interesting. I don't know if this is connected, but I was actually trying to retrieve these lyrics of a song I wrote probably when I was 23. And it was inspired by this horror film I saw when I was a little kid. It was like a made-for-TV horror film where there was this house in Boston or someplace, or Salem, and every time this one woman looked into the mirror, she would see like the witch trials or something, and it would horrify her, right? And I turned it into actually a happy song, but the idea of looking at the mirror to see, but the thing is, she was looking at the mirror and she's seeing somebody else, and isn't that what we all do? You know what I mean? What are you looking at when you look into the mirror? Or even with Jean Cocteau, he has a lot of images where people fall into the mirror, and he would use mercury, a bath of mercury, because it looks like a mirror, but it would become movable or fluid as you touch the mirror. And I think that's there's so much going into this notion of beholding face to face, and plus beholding oneself face to face, or beholding God face to face. There's so much in there, so rich.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Michael. Rafe, you're okay. What would you like? Do you understand the assignment? And if so, what would you like to put on the table?
I think in these conversations, it's kind of always my role, or at least that's how I feel, to sort of bring the idea of the body into the conversation. Right. When I first had the concept of encounter, right? I think a lot about the idea that we encounter reality, we encounter our experience of being through the actions of our body in the world. And because we have become such an abstract and textual culture, and now a digital culture, we become more and more blind to how much we're actually intrinsically embodied creatures. And I think that a lot of our confusions about things actually arise from this, and that if we break down the mind-body dualism and we start to study how the body experiences, as we can go back to Husserl and Heidegger, and particularly Merleau-Ponty, I think really points us to this experience. One of my favorite books is a book called The Spell of the Sensuous by David Abram. But I've been thinking about that, and I've been thinking about that really specifically recently in a conversation I've been having with John Vervaeke about ecological psychology, and how ecological psychology assumes a reality that is real, that has real relationships available to us outside of it, and then we encounter it, and then we are actively seeking through action always to be able to perceive the reality that is outside of us. And that I don't think that this is necessarily realized maybe outside of Vervaeke and some of the people who are working with him, but that actually presupposes metaphysical realism. And because an affordance or a constraint to me can't really be sort of recovered from a nominalist or constructivist metaphysics. That's the claim that I think I'm making, and I may be just not philosophically educated enough to steel man in a different position. But that's what I've been thinking a lot about. And so if in the body, and a deep bodied practice, when properly considered, can actually take us all the way down to the roots of our metaphysics, I think we've really grossly mistaken the power of these things and their proper place in our pedagogy. So that's what I'd like to put on the table.
Okay. Thank you. Karen, do you understand the assignment, and what do you have for the table?
Well, first I want to say what Rafe just brought up is I had put together a whole post for Twitter outlining the 4 main concerns of Dallas Willard. And it lines right up with that. And as soon as I got it put in, it disappeared. So I never got to post it to Twitter. So I'm going to have to do it again. But I thought of it because after I had the conversation with Rafe, I realized there were a lot of things that I couldn't coordinate in my brain while I was talking to him because Rafe is so brilliant. So anyway, I think he's right on target with that. So the thing that I would like to bring to the table today, and I don't know if this is going to be, it will definitely be a part of what I talk about because it fits right in that slot. But Jonathan Pageau, talking to Bishop Barron yesterday, said, the identity of something is bound in its purpose. And I think that statement is like central to everything that I talk about with art. And so to me, that is something I would really love to have a conversation about.
Okay.
In terms of what is identity, what is a bound, and what is purpose.
All right. Very good. Chris, do you understand your assignment, and what would you like to put on the table?
I like to think I understand it, but I'm sure I'm about to show that I do not. The talk I'm going to be giving is on the wounding gaze in Christ. I'm taking as a starting point the story in the Gospels in which, as Jesus is being led to his death, he looks at Peter. Peter sees himself being seen by Jesus and is struck to the heart and weeps bitterly. And I want to connect that to some of this is written, but as I said, it will remain unfinished until it's over. But I want to connect that to story like Bulgakov's vision of the Sistine Madonna, which has a similar effect on him. Talk about the ways in which the gaze of Christ shows up in other faces. You know, Christ's plays in 10,000 places, right? Which, fascinatingly enough, that Hopkins poem comes from a sermon by Gregory Nazianzen, and that Maximus, the confessor, gives that treats as a problem. So I'll deal some with that. But what I'm thinking about today, what I'm putting on the table today, is none of that, right? That was me sorting through what to put on the table and deciding against all of those. Is a passage in Franz Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption, where he talks about how Christians are pagans, but it's a paganism that serves God's purposes in the world. And he's a Jewish theologian who's decided against converting. It's been disallowed by God from converting to Christianity, and then writes this kind of astonishing book about how Judaism and Christianity fit within the purposes of the God of Israel. And there's a passage in which he talks about the gaze of God, and that for Christians, we are constantly having to sort out whose eyes are on us, and that tact requires us sometimes to imagine that we are being seen by the Father and sometimes being seen by the Son. And it is, of course, I'm going to disagree, but it is an absolutely astounding insight, I think, or at least a critique masked as an insight about what it means to be Christian. And I've only just started to begin to think about what it might mean. But as often happens with the Rosenzweig, there are these kind of like lightning bolts of claims or counterclaims that will knock you off your feet, and that's one for me.
What is the title and author of that book you just mentioned?
Hans Rosenzweig. So he was a colleague of Martin Buber. They co-wrote a translation of the Bible. The Eugen Rosenstock QC was also a friend. In fact, the three of them were kind of compatriots. He was a young German PhD student who ends up, he feels drawn to Christianity, decides against it, and ends up writing this book called The Star of Redemption, which is, he dies as a very young man, in his 30s. But it's a wonder of a book. I mean, a kind of endless set of, it's a dark, hard book, but I think a wonder. And it's full of reflections like that on, he makes a distinction, which is now common, but he makes a distinction between the hero and the saint that is such an astounding kind of difference. This particular section, the one that'll come up in the talk, is about the gaze of God and how, as pagans, Christians needed God close. That's what we've done with Jesus. That's what we've gotten with Jesus. But that we still need the transcendent gaze of the Father, and that the Christian life is a kind of play. Sometimes we're in the gaze of the Father, sometimes in the gaze of the Son, and it takes real tact. That's the word he uses for knowing when to see one or be seen by one, and when to see or be seen by the other.
Okay. Well, Nate, we're gonna move on to round 3, and round 3 is where each of you gets to point to something that someone else has put on the table and say, "Oh, look at that! That caught my interest, and why?" And Nate, of course, is this bear sitting at the buffet of ideas, and so this round is just perfectly suited for Nate. Now, Nate, your challenge is going to be, there's probably, you like everything in the buffet, but I'm going to ask you to prioritize and create a hierarchy here, at least, or maybe some synthesis. So go for it, Nate.
That is hilarious that you use that metaphor, because one of my professors at Evergreen, Dr. Richard Alexander, he described me in my evaluation as like an affable bear at a picnic table during a seminar. So hilarious that you chose that. So I definitely see a convergence with Karen's what Karen put on the table today, because I also noticed that same tweet from Peugeot, and my response to it was actually to reflect on how we've kind of lost the sense of names indicating a real meaning. And I talked about like how the refreshing experience of reading the First Nations translation of the Bible and seeing all the, like, Jesus and all the apostles like named like according to their purpose, which is like kind of their real identity. So for example, Jesus is called Creator Sets Free, and then they put Jesus in parentheses, so you still know who is being talked about. But this idea, and this is actually how in traditional cultures, like all names used to carry these kinds of meanings, which is connected to this idea of purpose. And then I also wonder, like, as I'm thinking about that, I'm wondering like exactly where purpose and meaning have to be connected, but I'm wondering what exactly is the nature between purpose and meaning. Are they completely synonymous, or is there a slight difference? Or like we have both of those terms, but they seem to be pointing in a similar direction ultimately. And I wonder what the difference might be. And I think this connects entirely to this idea of of identity, this underlying idea of identity, which is implied by the conference theme of encountering face to face. It's like, and which makes, and of course, my favorite line from Alice is actually the caterpillars. Who are you? Because that's the question we're all trying to answer. And so yeah, that's
all right. So I take that as a vote for Karen, and then some. Michael, what did you hear that sort of caught your attention?
When Rafe was talking about embodiment, because it's as a farmer, a guy who deals with animals on a daily basis, and I am acutely aware of embodiment. And actually, when I was working on this morning, I was working on an introduction to a book called Hunting, Hiking, and Holiness, which because the person asked me to write this because I'm probably the only Christian intellectually knows who hunts. but the relationship to nature, I mean, it's you're in a body. In fact, there's a great example that came up last week that, and I think this also touches on when Nate was talking about the imagination, because I think that the relationship of that embodiment and imagination, people, I think, don't think you can't do both at the same time, and I think you can. But anyway, what happened last week was an interesting thing. We have lambs that we're raising this year, and I'm the one who takes care of them. And my wife was out on the garden pulling weeds or something, and she tried to call the lambs over to throw them some carrot tops or something, and they wouldn't come. And then she realized when I went out there, I said, "Hey," and they come running. She said it's really like it says in the gospel. They know the voice of the shepherd, and it's true. It's true. But the thing is, when you have that kind of embodied experience, it's no longer theoretical. I mean, you could read the gospel and think, well, that's nice thought, right? But no, Jesus knew what he was talking about because he'd seen it, right? He'd experienced it. It couldn't be more embodied because they only responded to my voice, right? And doesn't make me special, but they know who I am, right? And they don't. I don't know who this lady with the weeds is, but you know what I mean? But that guy, I know that guy. But and you see that throughout the gospel, which is interesting because the history of Christianity is really, to some degree, or at least the history of Christian writing, is intellectuals and theologians writing for each other. But you turn to the gospel, and Jesus is talking to farmers and fishermen, right? So he's in the real world. You never read Aquinas talking about what the peasantry is going through, right? Or anybody. Probably not until you get to Luther. Do you hear any? And it's not that they weren't concerned, but they weren't writing for the peasantry. They were writing for other intellectuals, other academics.
All right, good. Rafe, what did you hear that sort of caught your imagination?
I was particularly struck by what Chris brought up about the idea of, both Christianity as paganism from the Jewish perspective, and the idea of being seen through the lens of the Father, the lens of the Son. I think that as someone who's deeply devoted to bringing people back into relationship to the natural world, it seems very clear to me that there is something about paganism which is actually necessary and recoverable to overcome the meaning crisis. Pagan just means in the field, right? It's the same as heathen. It has the same root as peasant, right? So if we look back at the pre-Christian era, we see a kind of worshiping of principalities that ask very dark things of us in many ways. But there's also a deep understanding and respect for our complete connection to the natural world. And one of the things that really alienated me about the evangelical Christianity that I grew up around was this sort of modernist sense of the world as something completely to be acted upon and not something to be deeply in relationship to. And something that's been very shocking to me as I've sort of come back towards Christianity is realizing, like, in Lewis and C.S. Lewis and in Tolkien, there's a very different relationship to Christianity. And we go back to the early Christian saints and St. Francis of Assisi and the Celtic tradition, as far as I can understand it, which is limited. And you see that there is this deep understanding that the way of being as a saint is actually something that has this deep embeddedness and understanding of our connection to the natural world. So I think that there's a proper relationship to respect for the creation that is intrinsic to I think good faithfulness to God, and that is something that I'm really concerned about and really interested in. And then the other thing is this idea that I've been playing with, because I was raised in a New Age spiritual household, and then I became an atheist, and my wife and I connected because we were both atheists, which was much less common for girls then. But I've moved towards Christianity, and she's still someone who considers herself an atheist. Our children were all born when that was my predominant sort of perspective on it. My oldest daughter is almost 12, and she's like kind of miffed that I'm interested in Christianity, and part of it comes from the sense that Christianity is very patriarchal. And I think that's somewhat mistaken, but it's a very strong perspective, and you can see in the myth, or in the way the story is constructed, why that's true. And so, why is God a father? And so I've been considering this idea that God is really beyond our capacity to describe. So when we describe God as the Father or as the Son, we're not describing a complete definitive description of reality. We're describing a proper way of relating to this thing, that we have to relate to God as a father, not that God is necessarily contained by the expression of the Father. That's what came for me out of responding to what Chris said.
Okay, good. Karen, what caught your ears?
Well, now that we're almost the second time around, there's stuff that caught me from all of this stuff too. So the thing that Chris Green was talking about with the wounding gaze, when he was talking about that, the loving gaze that Vervaeke always talks about, with how the mother brings the baby into being through the loving gaze. I think there's a deep connection between this idea of the wounding gaze and the loving gaze, and a deep connection with this idea of identity and the bound and the purpose. And so there's that. And then when Nate talked about witness and the poetic location, you said location, right? Not vocation. Was it vocation or location?
I said vocation.
Vocation. Okay.
Yeah.
First time I wrote down vocation, the second time I heard location. I think they're both very interesting. Both very interesting ideas in connection with witness. And then when Michael was talking about Jakob Böhme's idea that God's wrath and God's love have to do with this perception or disposition of the way that we experience God, I think that also fits into all of this. And Paul, you haven't put in your 2 cents yet.
I haven't. No, I didn't. There's lots on the table. Add more to the buffet. Poor Nate. What'll he do? But mine will come in. Mine will come in. Don't worry.
So, but I think mostly I'm interested in Rafe's comment about ecological psychology presupposes a metaphysical realism, because that's very central to the thing that I've been working on.
Okay. All right. So Karen doesn't help the vote at all because she summarizes what everyone said. Chris, can you point to one thing, or at least maybe a nexus of things that you heard, or something you sort of synthesized by what someone else said?
Yes, I think so. Let's see if this catches it all, because I think it does. David Milch, writer, director, showrunner for NYPD Blue, Hill Street Blues before that, Deadwood, so on. I think he's one of the great kind of pop philosophers of our time. And he gave a series of lectures a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago now, maybe more, on the idea of the writer. And it was really just him riffing on what he, as a writer, makes of Paul the Apostle and his story and what we have to learn from it. And he makes this kind of smart aleck claim that Paul's the most successful writer in history, that this is kind of writing in its most forceful, its most accomplished. But he's talking to screenwriters and prospective screenwriters in Hollywood during the strike years ago. But in those lectures, he makes a distinction between the fanciful and the imaginative that he actually learned from Robert Penn Warren, who was his teacher at Yale, a poet, to Michael's poetry. And Milch says that the fanciful is a way of making associations that are entirely private and rooted in my cravings. And so they belong only to my diseased interior world. Fanciful associations. Imaginative associations arise not from craving but desire, and speak to a shared reality. So that if I make an association imaginatively, other humans who don't come from where I come from, who don't have my location or my vocation, don't have my history, don't even have my language, if they can somehow catch the association I'm making and it's truly imaginative, they will know what I'm speaking of, right? To the point of metaphysical realism. And that imagination is our way of participating in the real. The fanciful is a refusal of that. And that all work, he says, all art comes down to being either fanciful or imaginative. And that the fight for the artist is to resist private, diseased associating, fanciful, and to yield, and this is the language he uses, to submit to the imaginative. But the imaginative is not made up. It's sensed. It's recognized. It's yielded to. The fanciful is made up in the way that we think of making things up. I think that comes pretty close to drawing together the themes here that we've discussed.
Yeah, that's good. So when I talk, I'm going to talk about what I've learned in my local estuary. And as of January, we started weekly estuary meetings at 9 a.m. Our regular worship services at 11. And we did this because although I loved my Sunday school class where we just basically did Bible study, we're not, and it did very well on my channel. I had hundreds of people enjoying my Bible studies online. Didn't really grab our local audience very much. And then we started doing Estuary, and I could sort of leverage a bunch of unchurched people who never see the value of coming to my church or any other church, and they're free on Sunday morning, and so they come into there. And then some of the church people that are curious about what their pastor's been doing for the last 5 years, and so they come into there and see what these strange randos who live in other places of Sacramento, what they have to think. And it strikes me that many of well, first I'll get into some of the embodiment themes here, and Michael's observation that so often, so much of Christian intellectual history are Christian intellectuals talking to each other, leaving out the kinds of people that Jesus spoke to. And actually for working preachers, that the people that never read books are the ones that pay preachers salaries. And if preachers don't learn to talk to them, they won't have salaries anymore. And so even though, I'm struck by Chris, who, you know, he's pulling out these names of these books is like, I've never heard of, but boy, that sounds good. And so listening to preachers can be kind of a nice bibliography to get more material. But Chris is a churchman, as his collar indicates, and he has to take all of this stuff. And if you listen to our Randos conversation, he's someone who very much is rooted in not church of fanciful literary flights, but churches of deep imagination. And as Rafe pointed out, and I loved Chris's. I'm gonna have to find that Rosenzweig book. I had to figure out, in fact, how to put that into Amazon and find something with it, but I did.
Oh, hey, listen, I'll get you a copy of the book if you agree to wear a clerical collar. I'll buy both for you. I'll buy both for you.
Oh, you have just made a whole bunch of people super happy. Anyway, and what I like about this panel is that, you know, for a long time I've talked about heaven and earth. And I know John Vervaeke sort of wants to dismiss two worlds mythologies, and I understand the dualism that he's resisting. But I think actually what makes humanity so unique in the creation that we know of is, in fact, that tension between, you know, I know some of my Jewish friends don't like the translation, but, you know, God has placed eternity in our hearts. And we might think about God placing eternity, which is, you know, just transcendence into this meat pump of blood in the middle of our bodies. And just that image to me, and most of I mean, gazing, looking faces, these are all that intersection between heaven and earth where they're chafing, because, you know, you look, they say love is blind, or rose-colored glasses, because we know that looking isn't just looking, that even in the span of attention, we are selecting and editing and projecting and creating. And I love that distinction between fanciful and, I'm going to go from imaginary to imaginal, because I think that's really what Vervaeke is pointing to, is that tension between, okay, so there's physics going on and my eyes are sort of picking up light that's bouncing off faces, but they aren't just arrangements of physics. They are themselves witnesses to biology, witnesses to materiality, witnesses to history. So I have no problem imagining that this group is going to be able to talk for the next hour or so from any of this buffet that we've just laid before us. So round 4, go for it. Now it's a free for all. Anybody can jump in and go for it.
I'd love to jump in.
Go for it.
There's a couple of things that really struck me in what Chris said, and then maybe I can connect it to what you were saying there, Paul. But Chris, you laid out a distinction between fancy and imagination, and then between craving and desire. And I think for a lot of people, it's going to be hard to do. I mean, craving sounds kind of like a synonym for desire. And then you added a qualifier, which is that craving is something diseased. So it moves us away from ease. And I was trying to grapple with this, and, you know, probably not surprisingly, John Vervaeke's wording and language comes to mind, right? This idea, he's talked about the distinction between the imaginal as being something that moves us towards the world, that moves us into greater capacity to work with the world, that when we're able to internalize and indwell the other through the imaginal, we're able to actually then act more powerfully. But fancy is a way in which we can then go hide from the world. We can go avoid the world. And so if we think about it in that language, in the language of reciprocal opening, right? There's a lot of what I think about within that idea of the 5 relationships that I that I talk about is that there are ways of acting, ways of practicing in the world that open up our capacity to relate. We can relate more powerfully. So if I can do parkour, I can relate more powerfully to the environment. It may seem like a relatively unimportant or maybe inaccessible or even hierarchical, right? As a young male, big, strong guy, like it's more available to me, to some people. And that may seem like not the nicest thing to actually focus on, but it is fundamentally good in a way to have this greater capacity to relate. And there's other greater capacities to relate, like the capacity to deeply empathize with and understand where someone's coming emotionally, or the capacity to articulate and understand where someone's thoughts are coming from. And those are powers in the same way that being able to jump is. And so I can enter my imagination as a thing that opens that capacity to relate powerfully across all these different relationships that we have to our experience of being, or I can use those very same things to buffer me from those same relationships. And maybe I can make an interesting connection here to the idea that Michael was talking about the wrathful gaze versus the loving gaze of Christ. Because I go back and forth. I don't know precisely if I'm a Christian or what exactly it means to be a Christian, but I've had some very strange and powerful experiences with what Christianity means or might mean in my life. My wife and I separated for 3 months at the beginning of the year, 4 months. And in the grieving of that and the processing of my father's passing, and I had to deal with a lot of stuff that I had kind of suppressed from my childhood. And there was this moment where I was crying about an experience of sexual abuse that I'd had, and I was dealing with that. And I kind of looked up and said, like, I need to believe. I have to believe that there's a Father in heaven who loves me. I need that in my life at this stage. And I went to this waterfall near the home that I grew up in, and I sat in front of this waterfall, and I basically said, like, if I have to suffer like this right now so that I can mend my family and be there for my children, I choose to bear this cross. I'm not going to step away from it. I'm not going to try to protect myself. I'm going to take all the pain. And I asked for Christ to come into me, and I felt racked by it. I felt this experience of being loved that was not it was not a comfortable experience. It was not anything close to a comfortable experience. It'd be very easy to think of it as like being put in the fire and destroyed by the fire. And I had this moment when I felt as if there were nails that were going through my hands, and my arms are spreading out to the side. And I'm there, in that place, in this place that was connected to my own father. But it's raw. It's incredibly painful. And yet it opens me up in my capacity to relate to the most important people in my life. So there's obviously a really deeply personal and emotional element to what I'm sharing. And so I've kind of lost a little bit of the articulation of how all these things connect. So maybe somebody else can pick it up and help cohere what I offer. Because I think there is a coherence there, and I'm just struggling to find it in the emotional intensity of what I shared. Paul, you're muted.
Rafe, you bring in the central vision of much of Christendom, which is, of course, Jesus spread on a cross, and are seeing that. And if you look at a crucifix, I don't know what everybody else does, but I think it's just natural to look at the face of the one on the cross. And I'm trying to on my channel go through and with some people who are wanting to join the church, go through the Heidelberg Catechism. And of course, the Heidelberg Catechism is very substitutionary atonement-ish, which is a dogma that is quite contested at this point in Christian history. But there are all these tensions of, okay, you've got the Trinity, and how do the crucifixion and the Trinity relate? and especially this question of seeing. I mean, a lot of the critique of substitutionary atonement is the critique that, you know, does God turn his face away? Is this hell? Is this, but you know, in the story, with the moment that you realize that in that intense moment, you realize what I think everyone realizes in a marriage or in a family, that there will be times in that family when the future of the family depends on your embracing a degree of sacrifice and even the death of something in you. And I mean that, and that is, it is embodied. It is not simply an abstract exchange or a move of accounting, which I think is one of the more valid critiques of something like substitutionary atonement, because it reduces the Christian story to an accountant's ledger. And the Christian story is a story of blood and brutality and death. So no, I think that very much fits.
So I this is sort of an academic trivia. What you just said was amazing. First of all, I just want to say that, and I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. So this is sort of, comparatively, this is sort of an academic triviality, but that distinction between fancy and imagination, that obviously caught my attention right away, because the presentation I just gave, that's really a focal, like, turning point in the entire presentation, because that idea comes to us through Coleridge, is the first one who draws that distinction, and that was one of the figures involved in my presentation. So I think that's a rich distinction. And what Coleridge actually says about the primary imagination, he says it's a finite echo of the infinite I am.
Yeah, and if I can be daring enough, I should have mentioned that Milch's account via Warren is to say that the imaginative still has association in it. It's just it has a different integrity. And Rafe, thank you for sharing that with us. It reminds me so much of Simone Weil's story and her experience, but also the story of others. My PhD work was on early Pentecostalism. This is some of what Paul and I discussed. And there were a number of what in that tradition is called testimony, of people being brought into a felt, like the phenomena of being crucified, the feeling of the wounds. And theologically, what I would argue now is that that's because metaphysical realism at its deepest depth is just the life of Jesus. That he is the heart and mind of creation, and that his personal experience, like that, what happened to the man we know as Jesus of Nazareth, the one that Mary gave birth to, loved into being with her gaze, and the one that Pilate killed, that all things are his life. And when you are opened up to reality, that's what you're running up against. Because that is what is, right? All things are what they are because Jesus is who he is. And he is who he is, having lived this life that ended in that death. And then was, what we mean by resurrection is not something that happened after he died, but something that God has done in taking that whole life from the conception to the murder and execution and making that the heart of all things. So without being too familiar, Rafe, it's your story. My read of it would be, you're running up against reality. You're running up against the heart of all things. And that's, maybe this is too controversial too early in the day. To me, that's not about being Christian. I don't think the Christ who is the heart of all things, I don't think his agenda is to make Christianity great again. I think he wants to make all things well. And that, whatever that leads us in terms of our vocation and location, like that's reality. And I think your story is witness to it. And I'm grateful for it. I'm glad you shared it.
One of the things that I think has been about Estuary in the corner, I loved Michael's story about the lambs. My wife and I have been raising a support animal, and came to us as a puppy, and she's now over a year old, and we turn her in at the beginning of November. And this September, the original plan was always that the dog would go to school with my wife and spend her day in the classroom with my wife, and now that has come to be, so she's no longer here next to me in the study. But part of what Chris just brought out is something, of course, that Peugeot has been bringing out very consistently, and Peterson now more and more often, that the Christian story isn't simply a narrative that you can sort of get into chronologically. It is in a sense, it is a description of the way the world works. And I think about Michael's raising lambs, and it is not the intent of Michael, I would imagine, to have, I don't know, Michael, you tell us, or are you going to have just a bunch of old sheep around your farm that die of natural causes? Is that your business plan?
No, they're heading toward the freezer, actually. Sorry, vegans. Yeah.
And so, I think part of the great lie of the modern media-soaked American imagination is that lambs always stay lambs in this world, and that the reality is that you so beautifully and vulnerably shared with us, Rafe, is that every family comes into this world at the risk of the life of the mother and the risk of a whole bunch of other things of the father, and the sacrifice of them both. And the children don't know it yet, but their future sits with the both of you. And it takes sacrifice.
So all this talk about animals, I have to tell the little story. We have a dog that we rescued 7 years ago, and we don't know exactly how old she is, maybe 10 or 11 years old, something like that. Every time I cut up vegetables, she comes and sits at my feet because she loves vegetables, and I just give her the odds and ends of whatever it's easier than bending over and throwing it in the garbage. So I just toss it off the counter to her, and she sits there. And the other day I noticed as she was sitting there, she has this loving gaze on her face. She is completely trusting in me that I will give her something. And even if I don't give her something, she doesn't get angry with me. She'll just wander away. But if I give her something, she's always happy because to her, it's a good. And it made me think of the story of the Syrophoenician woman and how when she said, even the dogs eat the crumbs that are, that fall from the table. And I thought, I used to think, well, why would Jesus, no, I guess Jesus said that to her, right? I'm all flustered now, but the point is that being like a dog simply means that I am sitting at the master's feet, filled with trust that what the master is going to offer me is good. And for me, that was such a beautiful picture. And the other day, in this conversation between Jonathan Peugeot and Bishop Barron was talking about this idea that in our modern world, people want to divorce themselves from the body, or to be able to manipulate the body to make it what they want it to be. And that made me think about many times in my own past when I've had this thought, when my body is less than perfect because I haven't been taking care of it. I have this thought that I want to say to other people who aren't respecting me or who aren't loving me the way I want to be loved. why can't you just love me for who I am and not what I look like? And all of a sudden, it's like the tumblers fell into place. I am not the me that I am is not divorced from my body. My body is a result of the me that I am and the choices that I've made and the places that I've lived and the experiences that I've gone through. So that very thought of why can't you love me for who I am is actually a way of living in this fanciful world where I'm finding a way of denying reality so that I can live over in this fanciful world, which is a way of running away from the true imagination that is required to enter into life. And it's an insight I just had today, so it's not very well articulated, but anyway, I thought it fit in here.
Yeah, and Karen, I think it's interesting, pastorally, speaking from that place for a moment. I think it's easy when we're talking, as academics or philosophically, and we're kind of diagnosing the disease, as Rafe said, of modern life, to talk about it as people wanting to be able to escape their embodiment. But as a pastor, what I witness is not so much people wanting to as feeling the pressure to do so. And what I mean by that is, I think there's something about the way our lives have come to be lived. And I don't think that the blame lies with individuals. I think this is where principalities and powers, like the flow of things, takes on a life of its own in which we get caught up. That a lot of what people, and I experienced this personally, right? So I think a lot of us have a hard time being in our own bodies, not because we have some kind of ambition to escape embodiment, but because there's something about the form of life we are being pressured to live that's separating us from our bodies all the time. And of course, this is felt differently by children than by adults, and women than men, and race and health, like all these different factors make it particular to each one of us. But I do think that this is Sarah Coakley. Here's another book for your reading list, Paul. Like Sarah Coakley has done a lot of really good work on this, that we are obsessed with embodiment in some ways in the modern world, health, the look of our bodies, so on. But and we're hypersensitive to pain, but we are deeply uneasy with our physicality and our embodiment. And she's showing how we've kind of never been more aware of how the body works physiologically. We've never been more aware of how to manage pain. Never had more techniques for it. We've never been less at ease in our own skin. And what I'm saying is, as a pastor, I see this as something that afflicts people, not something they're reaching for so much as something they don't know how to live without that unrest.
Right. Well, I mean, look at all the people, right, who claim to have been born in the wrong body, right? Which is, so just let's go back to what some of you guys said earlier. Let's make Christianity pagan again. I mean, I'm serious, because I think, and I think about this a lot, I write about this a lot, that here's a great author for you, H.J. Massingham, the English writer from the mid 20th century, who wrote a book called The Tree of Life, which I think is one of the best books ever written. But he was vehement that part of where Christianity went off the rails is when it got separated from the cosmos. It became an intellectual or a set of propositions. And he points to Jesus, dealing with real people and doing real things and being carpenter as exemplary moments of that. And so even on our farm, a big part of what we do is make Christianity pagan again, and celebrating festivals on the farm in nature at the right seasons, whether it's harvest or planting or whatever it happens to be. And And Nate saw this a few weeks ago. I floated the idea of doing a Kickstarter to do an album of Catholic neo-pagan folk rock, which I'm going to do, but I just have to map it out in my head first. But I think, and the reason I've been doing this for so long is because I know from experience what it's, that Christianity disconnected from the real is just, what is it? It's a kind of Gnosticism. It's disembodied, quite literally. And what I see with what I saw with students, what I see with the trans phenomenon going on right now, are people in distress and in pain, not because they were born in the wrong body, but because they're separated from their bodies, or separated from the creation, and through whatever that happens to be, through medication or crummy food or whatever it is, or just living their lives online. And I thought, actually, if you think about it, a lot of this trans stuff exploded after COVID, and all those kids were closed up in their houses for 2 years.
Yeah.
Exploded exponentially. You hardly saw any of that in colleges before that, but after, it's insane.
It was another precipitating factor. It was already beginning, but there's a claim, see like Sapolsky make and others that the trans is a real phenomenon of the brain, that we actually can sort of have a female brain in a male body or vice versa. But the neurobiology that I've tracked down really doesn't support that. One of the interesting things that we see is, one, there is a level of androgynous aspect to neural morphology that we see in people who are homosexual. But if you control for sexuality, somebody who's born in a male body, who's attracted to women, who identifies as a woman, is no more female-like than any other heterosexual man in his brain morphology. And a homosexual who's attracted to, or a man who's attracted to men who decides to become a woman, also no more feminized than any other homosexual man. So that claim doesn't really stand up. But what's interesting is there is a neurological difference, and that neurological difference is in the area of body mapping. So like Slate Star Codex has published about this in like his surveys of his rationalist readership. He's found that there's a huge correlation between Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is literally like your connective tissues don't connect well. So you just don't have as good ability to feel connected and integrated in your body, and trans identification. So it is not so much an actual sex or gender dysfunction as it's a disembodiment.
Well, I don't know if you caught this. There was
like at the neurological level, we can justify that claim.
Tucker Carlson interviewed this physician and her brother who used to work for, I think he worked for the food industry, and she was connecting microplastics to this because I think some microplastics are, I can't remember the term exactly, but they imitate estrogen.
They're endocrine disruptors.
Yeah.
Or pseudoestrogens.
Yeah. So.
But, sorry, to not get too derailed on that specific issue, I wanted to go back to that idea of, oh man, I'm trying to link. There's a bunch of different things that have kind of been occurring to me, but one that I think is really interesting is the difference between the word environment and the word nature. Right? We've said nature a lot in this conversation. We haven't said environment. Someone pointed out that it's very interesting to think about environment versus nature, because you have a nature. A nature is what arises intrinsically, right? Or what you arise from. But environment is something that you are contained within, right? You might be in the environment of a nightclub or the environment of something else. So when environmentalism begins to conceptualize the world as us, as humans, and the environment that's external to us, we're actually jumping into the same sort of Cartesian duality, the same disembodiment of the human being. And the idea that essentially our proper relationship to nature is to leave it as untouched as possible, rather than that our proper relationship to nature would actually be to have a positive sum relationship with it. And that these are very distinct worldviews. And one of them, again, sort of is a domicide, right? It's the death of our home. We are no longer at home in the natural world. We are an external agent. We are a cancer upon the earth, versus we are a part of the earth. We arise from the earth. We are inherently earthlings. And so I really love the work of Mary Harrington, and she talks about this idea that of biolibertarianism, right? We have looked at the body, we've looked at our relationship to nature, and we have decided that the good, the transcendent good, is to increase our power to escape all of the demands of nature. Jonathan Pajot was doing a discussion, I can't remember who with, but he quoted this feminist author who said that the point of theory can't be about truth and falseness. It has to be about strategic goals. And those goals have to be about escape from a calcitrant nature, something like that. So the idea is our nature itself is what constrains us from whatever the transcendent good, this Gnostic good of moving beyond it. And I think that this is the most, I think it's a perennially attractive illusion in the face of our suffering that invariably leads us to greater suffering. And it happens over and over and over again throughout history. And so give me a moment. My brain is struggling to cohere this, because there's a really important point here about accepting our constraints and trying to recover how to live within them. Right? I've been thinking about this analogy of a guitar, right? So there's kind of two types of freedom you can discover with a guitar. One is a total freedom of action with the guitar. So a toddler could have total freedom of action with the guitar, but you won't make great music. But there's another kind of freedom that comes when you enslave yourself to the guitar, when you make yourself disciplined by the guitar, so that you do the difficult things of learning to finger with your hands and move your hands in specific ways. And you can only move them in very specific ways, and they're demanding and they're hard. And when you do that, you end up with the freedom to make beautiful music using a guitar. And there's only a very set, constrained way of using that guitar, right?
But that only works when you love. That only actually works when you love the thing. So you have to first love the guitar before you'll put yourself into the service of the guitar in that way, in order to actually master the guitar. And that's the same of anything else we want to learn. It's true. We have to love it first in order to be able to engage in that relationship and accept those restraints.
Yeah, I think that being a man is like being a guitar. There's a constraint on what I am. I am not someone who can bear a child, right? And being a woman is like being a guitar. There's a constraint. There's a set of options that are distinct for men and women and how we interact with the world. And the problem is that we have a culture that actually tells us that all of those constraints are bad, and everything that moves us away from those constraints is good, which then hides from us the capacity to love how we show up with this, right? Like my body, I'm 6'1", I weigh 220 pounds. You can hear the tone of my voice. I have a different set of affordances than my wife. She's 5'1.5", and she weighs, 130 pounds, right? So if there's a bear in the backyard, you better believe that it's my job to go yell at the bear, right? Because a bear is going to run away from me much more easily than it's going to run away from her. And if I don't understand that my body inherently speaks to this, right? If the kids are acting out of line, it's so much easier for me to discipline them, right? takes one crack of my voice, whereas she'll have to bid for their attention 5, 6, 7 times, just because my voice has a physical impact on them that's distinct from her voice, right? I am an instrument that has a different set of registers available to it, a different set of affordances that I have. And so I can love that. I can love that about myself, or I can reject it. I can see those things about me as being, you know, downstream of some oppressive patriarchal history that makes it, you know, me evil and bad for embodying masculinity, right? And we tell this story of I'm ranting, but the story that women, that the traditional capacities that women express are those of the subjugated class, and the traditional aspects and inherent capacities of men are those of the oppressor class. And nobody wants to be either of those things, right?
So I'm going to go a weird place with it. I'm going to go a weird place with this. There's something that Karen said at the very beginning that made me very happy. When she said she thinks all of us are artists. Blake would have completely agreed with you, by the way. And I think you're onto something there. And there's, Karen, I've heard you talk about this many times, so I think this will connect with you. It's impossible to do anything artfully without embracing restraints, because you can't actualize. Nothing can be actualized, right? If you have no constraints at all, then you'll be left with just pure potency, and you can never actualize anything. So in order for anything to be actualized, there has to be constraints in order for that to happen, which I think the arts actually give us a really good way of relating to that, whether it be Karen's painting or Michael's music, or, you know, and of course, well, I want to use art in the broadest possible way, because there's an artful way to do anything that you could possibly do as a human.
You have to know the rules before you can break them, right? The baby who plays guitar is breaking the rules, but doesn't know what the rules are. You know, my friend's dad was from Scotland. He was our soccer coach. So we're like 10. He's teaching us how to get the ball down the field, how to play all the positions. When we were 14, he said, "Well, boys, I've taught you how to play the game. All that's left is to teach you how to cheat." Right? And it's the same thing with playing, you know, with improvisation, whether it's jazz or bluegrass or folk music. You got to know how to do it until you can. We used to call it, when I play with my friends, we call it mysticism, because we'll be in this moment of improvisation, and you're kind of just plugged in everybody, and you're like, "Whoa, where did that come from?" Right? It's like a spiritual event that transpires, but it couldn't happen if you didn't already have the mastery of the instrument.
And that, by the way, that experience you just talked about, that's how you know that you've made contact with imagination versus fancy.
Karen, you wanted to get in there. You've tried a couple times. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to go back to what Rafe was talking about with the current obsession about patriarchy being bad. And I think one of the things that comes out of my exploration of creativity is that I remember, like 15 years ago, my teacher, who was a dyed-in-the-wool atheist, but he understood these principles of creativity so deeply. And he was explaining that the only way you can create unity in a painting is with dominance. So if dominance doesn't express itself in the painting, there can be no unity. And I thought, well, that's a pretty deep thought there. You know, I've been thinking about it for 15 years. And that's exactly the picture of patriarchy, that the male dominance is in service of the focal point that comes out of the work, which is the offspring. So the male is dominantly kind of covering everything and reaching down and bringing out the beauty in the environment. Maybe I'm using the wrong word there, environment or nature. Or I wanted to ask you, Rafe, when you also talk about the ecological psychology or ecological perception, all these things that J.J. Gibson talked about. Does environment fall in the category of ecology, or does nature fall in the category of ecology?
Sorry, you broke up there for me. What was the last question?
Ecology, is that environment or is that nature?
Mm. I'm not sure that I have a good answer for that. Sorry. Like there's a
Well, we can think about it and maybe talk about it more when we get to.
yeah. We, there's a utility to all these binaries, right? Like there's a another word we might use for environment is like arena, right? An environment is like an arena. So John talks a lot about agent arena relationships. We're always looking to get an optimal grip in an agent arena relationship. Here's a question, right? Like, is this the right arena to be discussing issues of gender, right? So when that conversation comes up, it's a conversation I have a lot of passion about. I've been doing a lot of research on, but it's always a question of like, okay, that can derail a conversation very easily. It can move it in a direction that kind of, it has a lot of gravity. So then there's a question when it arises, okay, is this the arena that we should allow that to happen? Or should we try to allow some of these other things to breathe? And then, so ecological psychology, like J.J. Gibson famously said, he was less interested in what's in your head than what your head is inside of. Right. And that's, to me, also where like ecological psychology starts to move towards metaphysical realism, because for it to matter more what your head's inside of, then the thing that's outside of it has to be made up of lawful, consistent patterns that you can actually be in relationship to. So if nominalism tells us that the only thing that is consistent across the things that we name is the names that we give them, that puts all of the onus inside into the internal will, right? So that makes sense. That sort of gives us a line towards this mind-body dualism, which gives us information processing theory of cognition. And constructivism is the same, right? Like, yes, there are real laws, but they're mind dependent, right? But what ecological psychology assumes is that constraints are a real aspect of the world, right? Like I can grasp this bottle, right? Graspability is contained not in the bottle and not in the hand, but in the relationship between them. And it's a real thing because some things are graspable and some things are not graspable, right? And I cannot make my house graspable by my hand. A house is not a graspable thing, right? So for me, that it's so profound to me to do that. And then when we think about a lot of these questions, they start to be viewed very differently. It's like, I think that my well-being is not maximized by trying to treat the world as affording me freedoms I really don't have. Right? It's grasped by saying, what is a guitar? And what does it mean to learn to play the game of that guitar well? I am a husband. That's a game, right? It's a set of constraints and affordances. Now there's another game I could go play, the game of being a pickup artist, right? I can't play both, right? I can try, but it will ultimately fail. Those two games are incongruent. So there's a set of freedoms that I have to, a set of affordances that I have to set aside in order to allow myself to play this game, right? If we want to play soccer, we can't also play volleyball.
I want to talk about Michael's
You
comment
can have it all.
about the soccer coach saying, now I want to teach you how to cheat. Because there's something there. Because although we've all been talking about the necessity of constraints, and I completely agree, we also don't want to come to a place where we accept constraints as absolute. Because part of what we are supposed to do is to actually find ways to go beyond what we assume are the constraints. And that's part of what mastery allows people to do. And this actually, you can see this in like our language itself can actually create a constraint. And this relates exactly to what I've been thinking about the vocation of the poet, because poets, in creating new meaning poetically, actually open up new possibilities that did not exist before. This is part of this is why this idea of the poetic, and I'm using poetic in the largest possible sense, because this applies to athletic endeavor or any other possible field of human engagement that you can, because I'm more connected to poetry, like I can see that, but if you think of poetry in terms of it, like if it's just original meaning of just doing and making, you can see how it applies to all of our activities. So we have this possibility to actually like make an addition to the creation and expand those constraints. That doesn't mean we have no constraints,
right.
But it doesn't mean, but it does mean that we should push the boundary. We are meant to push the boundaries of those constraints,
right? And
well, I want to jump in here because I'm not exactly disagreeing with you, but I want to add another perspective here, and that is that I don't think constraints are the same thing as rules. So what happens with jazz is you're actually creating tighter constraints, because now you're not only constrained by your capacity to play the instrument, but you're constrained by the actions of all the other people that are playing the instrument at the same time as you are. And what that does is actually generate a deeper level of creativity than you could generate without the tightness of those constraints. So creativity actually comes out of putting yourself under deeper and deeper constraints, because constraints aren't the same thing as rules.
Well, there's that, but I mean, even with examples like from jazz or bluegrass or whatever, or the Beatles, there's an element of, I don't want to call it prophecy necessarily, but there's an element of letting the future come to the present. Because if you think about it, with rules and constraints and and conventions, whether it's in music or painting or whatever, and those are useful things, but the people who really the real visionaries in all of those domains, they at the same time where they're grounded in the tradition and whatever skills are, they bring in something from the future that that there was no context for.
Right.
And jazz is like that. I mean, you can certainly, people have tried to trace the DNA of jazz to African rhythms and these other kinds of instruments, but there's also something that comes from the future. And the same with the arts, right? And in poetry in particular, there's a prophetic mode of poetry that like Nate was saying, it unleashes something. I mean, William Blake's a great example of this, but it unleashes something to the present that, in the case of Blake, it took scholars 200 years to catch up with him. They just thought he was crazy, because it was as if we were to go back into the Middle Ages and tell them about airplanes and the internet. They're like, okay, let's put him away. He's so far ahead.
Yeah, Michael, I want to use an example. From the world of sport. I'm a baseball guy, so I'm going to use a baseball example. In 1921, the first year that Babe Ruth hit over 50 home runs, he hit more home runs than the rest of Major League Baseball combined. Before Babe Ruth, the home run was just like not a big part of the game of baseball at all. Primarily, the way the game was played was small ball, like bunting, stealing bases. Games were typically low scoring. Babe Ruth completely changed the sport of baseball forever in what he did in his area of artistry.
I think this conversation about constraints, I love the point you just made, Karen, and I love the point you made, Michael, because in many ways eschatology is the future coming at us, and in many ways the I've got an echo from one of you. I don't know who. In many ways, the concern of biblical narrative is how, in fact, we deal with constraint. So Israel is constrained in Egypt. How is Israel freed from Egypt? Of course, Moses tries the revolutionary path. He kills the Egyptian who is oppressing the child of Israel. And so you have this whole, and then of course, Israel's brought into the desert. And of course, the desert is just a world of constraint. The desert is a place where there is no natural life. And then of course you get to Jesus in the first century culture war, which is a much bloodier one than we have now, thank God. But all of this tension between Jesus and the Pharisees and the aristocracy and the Essenes and the Zealots is how, in fact, can the set of constraints that God's holy land and God's holy people are located in, how can these constraints be overcome? And of course, they are very concerned with the future prophesied by the Hebrew prophets that, maybe after the Babylonian exile, that future will come. Well, maybe through the Persians and through Cyrus, that future will come. And they're still living in that tension. Well, how can the future come to us, this future that is given to us, this future that we believe in? And what, in fact, is the proper manner of dealing with these constraints? And of course, the strange answer that Jesus gives is the cross, which seems and of course, everybody looks at him. And in fact, even in the selection of how they chose to mock Jesus, he saved others. Well, what did he save them from? He saved them from the constraints of lameness, the constraints of blindness, the constraints of all of these things. He saved others from these constraints, but he cannot save himself from the constraints of the nails and the wood. And so, this dance that we all have to navigate in the world is, and then part of T. Grog is asking in the comments, because I do keep my eye on it, what is the gospel? And in many ways, the gospel is the question of, well, human being, born to die, limited in all of these different ways. And of course, as we've grown in technology, the gospel seems more and more useless because, well, all of these constraints I can sort of evade with power and technology. And then we continue to we continue to see that, oh, yeah, but what about the constraint of my brother who is also my adversary? And where my technological means of eliminating my constraints comes at the cost of these people. I'm willing for them to pay that cost because I can make them pay that cost. And, this seems to me the drama of the Bible can be seen through this window of constraint.
I'd like to do something in here. Going back to what Nate said about how an artist, in some sense, a poet can kind of show us that we are that it's possible to set outside a set of constraints that we thought that we were held by, in a sense. And if we look at motor learning, what we'll find is that there's kind of, we have a tendency to actually freeze certain capacities in the body when we're trying to learn a new skill. So we're trying to reduce the number of variables that the body has to control. And so if you look at somebody who's learning to throw a ball, you'll notice that they throw just with their arm and shoulder. And if you look at someone who's a very experienced thrower, you'll see that they can rear back on one leg, release the weight of the body, step forward, lunge, and they can coordinate that entire thing. And so what we see is that as a developmental cycle, performance doesn't move linearly up. But what tends to happen is we reach a peak of performance that's possible within the set of parameters that are available in the version of the game that we have currently adopted. And when we adopt a game that allows us a wider set of parameters, we'll regress. Performance will actually destabilize, and then it will come back up to the baseline and then improve it. And we see this kind of developmental cycle across many different aspects of development. So part of what we're doing when we're playing on the edges of things is we're actually discovering that we've constrained things that are actually now necessary to integrate in order to grow. Jordan Peterson talks a lot about the idea of the hero's journey. And the one he most often points to is this idea that the hero is somebody who goes out and confronts chaos and makes order out of it. You kill the dragon, you get the gold, right? But there's another aspect of the hero's journey. In the book's Maps of Meaning, I think it's a tailor who goes and basically sews up a hole in the sky that allows rain to fall again on the parched kingdom. And what the rain represents is novelty. It represents the capacity to see something new, to grow, right? So the water represents chaos. So there's a way in which we go out and we bring the new in intentionally. I think of this as kind of part of like parkour as a process is a kind of confrontation with chaos, with undifferentiated potential, where we bring something out of it. But in the same sense, the people who originated parkour, they had the capacity to see an undifferentiated potential and bring it forth that other people didn't see. Every kid will kind of run and jump and climb trees if you take them out into nature. But we as a culture had codified walls and ramps and stairwells and handicap ramps as spaces where you walked. And these kids went out and said, well, you can vault over a rail. You can jump between rails. You can do a flip off of a rail. And they're recovering that. So when I think about the analogy of the guitar, right? There's a type of reaching for freedom that results in no capacity and is often destructive. So then we need some constraints. We have to learn to finger the guitar. We have to learn to strum the guitar. We have to learn to make chords. We have to learn to tune the guitar. All of those things are difficult, not fun to learn, but then we can play. But we can also become excessively ordered in the way that we view the guitar, because it turns out the guitar can actually be tuned in many different alternative tunings that open up new artistic horizons. Right? A Jimmy Page can come in and start using a violin bow on a guitar, and it turns out that actually works. People can drum their guitar while they're playing the guitar, and it turns out that when you have mastery and when you understand the constraints you're playing with, all of those things become possible. So it's not that the way that I think about this is you want to understand what the constraints are so that you can discover the set of playable games and not get lost in all these games that aren't actually playable.
I'm gonna do a wrap up pretty soon, but Chris hasn't had much. I mean, Chris can probably get a sense of this is going to be an interesting group to get a word in. Chris, I don't know if you wanted to say something about this before I put in my closing round that is that Vendonk doesn't agree with, but
thank you for that, Paul. No, I mean I'm learning a lot and catching up quickly here. I will say to Rafe's analogy of the guitar, the conversation recently here about constraints and rules. I think this is a problem built into what we call Christianity and into what has been revealed in Christ. So I'm thinking about Maximus, the Confessor, who will talk about modes of being, right? That the story of Jesus walking on the water. So he's asleep in the boat. He wakes up and calms the storm, and the disciples are in that same boat fighting the storm, and he comes walking across the water to them. And often in Christian preaching, those stories are read as showing kind of two sides of Jesus. As a human, he sleeps in the boat. As a human, he rides in the boat with them. But as God, he calms the storm or walks on the water. And Maximus makes the point that we mustn't talk like that, actually. That he is both divine and human in the sleeping and in the walking on the water. And that his humanity, because of its communion with the life that gave it rise, is capable of modes for now unfamiliar to us. But that he is a human being walking on the water, not somehow forsaking his humanness, walking on the water as God. And as true as I think that is, and I I think I'm as convinced of that as I can be of anything. There is a shadow to that teaching, which is that we can break into those modes at will. We can find those new modes. So Ivan Illich, who's hugely influential for me, who's talked about all of these things in ways that I think are really insightful, decades ago. But what he talks about is the mystery of iniquity. There are two notions of Illich that I think I find myself coming back to over and over again. One is the mystery of iniquity. The other is the monstrosity of counterproductivity. That part of what happens because we are tool making creatures is that we can actually make tools that are so effective. They don't just work, they work too well. And that tragedy is that our capacity to do something too well. But this is what haunts human being. And it's not that we fail to do the good, it's that we do the good too well that haunts us. And if you kind of hold those ideas together with what Rafe is talking about here and what we've been batting around, to use Nate's baseball analogy, is I think that there's something really true about our capacity to break the rules, to cheat, to find new modes of being. That is essential to what it means to be human. But if we do that unwisely, we end up becoming counterproductive and our story becomes tragic. And I think that's where we're living. We're living in a moment in which we were doing something that was good or striving to, and we were too good at it. And now we're in the tragic situation of having done our work too well, and we're living with the monsters of counterproductivity. And some of that is because there is evil at work against us. I mean, that hasn't come up yet in this conversation, but both as a theologian and as a priest, I'm fully convinced, right, that this doesn't all come down to that metaphysical realism includes accounting in some way for the malice of evil, that evil intends to undo us, and that without just falling into sheer superstition, we do have to account for the fact that there is malice at work against us in the world somehow. And it wants to encourage that monstrosity of counterproductivity. So I think that kind of registers where my mind and heart are, having heard this.
All right. Well, part of Estuary is actually having a bounded time. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give everyone here in this group a moment to give us a takeaway from this conversation. And then it'll be about noon California time. So it'll be the top of the hour wherever you are. And I'll certainly thank the guests for all being here. And I'll sort of, as I've done for years, announce sort of the end of the official meeting. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the link, and any of our guests who have other things they want to do, or they're just really sick of all these blue shirts, you can flee. But any of you want to stay and try your luck at the sea monsters that are going to come in through the mouth of the estuary into this group and do some of the chaos that they've been doing in the hive mind while we've been talking, you're free to stay for a little while. And I'll probably do this maybe for another hour, and then I'll land the plane. So Nate, takeaways from today's conversation.
I think we're going to have a great conference, because I really think that the conversation flowed very, very easily, and it's a good group of folks. And I have a lot to think about. I have a lot to think about from this conversation. I have a lot to think about building up to the conference. And thank you everyone for coming.
All right, great. Michael, takeaways from this conversation.
It was very nourishing conversation, and I thank you all. And I forgot to mention, the selling point for me for the conference was the barbecue. Looking forward to that, Nate.
Oh, hey, Michael, I want to make sure you have a guitar available, electric or acoustic?
Acoustic.
Okay.
Really? Did you really have to ask that, Nate? All right, Chris, takeaways from this conversation.
I'm terrible at this kind of summing up, as anyone who's heard me preach knows. One of the things I love about it is that not only do I not know many of you, and a couple of you I know somewhat. Most of what you're talking about is not in the normal flow of my conversations, and I love the chance that gives me to hear things I've not heard, read things I've not read, and that's been a gift today. So I want to say a special thanks again for Rafe sharing his personal story.
Yeah. We always say in Estuary meetings that you know it's working when people start getting personal. And yeah, absolutely. Karen, takeaways from today's conversation. You're muted, by the way. So
I just have to say Nate's a genius. I don't know how he put this group of people together, because I had no idea how it was going to work with everybody together. But man, we are clicking on all cylinders. So I'm excited about the meeting in September. And I'm really happy that Michael's going to have a guitar available, because I hope we all get to sing.
That's the plan.
all right. Rafe, you get the last takeaway. Final word. What are your takeaways from today's conversation?
I guess I just have this idea that I didn't say earlier that I wanted to say, which is when we were talking about constraints over and over again, one of the things that came up for me was this idea that what does a all-powerful, unlimited being lack? Lacks limits. And the Christian story having this element where the divine itself becomes embodied and suffers everything that we suffer, I think is it points us towards a profound realization that our correct way of orienting towards being is one that accepts the sacrifice of allowing ourselves to be constrained and of trying to play the game well within that. And to echo what Chris said about this idea of we can move towards a good too well. I think that's when that good is a local good, and we start to sacrifice the transcendent good to those local goods. And I think that that's exactly where we are. We become extraordinarily powerful at pursuing goods that are actually undercutting the highest good, because at the same time that we've made ourselves powerful, we made ourselves blind. And hopefully this conversation can help with that a little bit. So that's my ending point.
All right. Thank you, Rafe. And thank you all for joining me here on the channel and for coming on the live stream. And you all are released. You can just go whenever you need to go. But I would say stay at least, especially for this first rando, because this young fella, he already showed his camera. This young fella is a storied guy. He was one of the first randos. I don't know how old he was when he first contacted me from my very first video. And, Julian is a Hutterite who lives in Canada. And many people, OGs in the corner, know Julian because he is sharp and he always brings something good to the table. Julian, did you just are you there welding dumpsters or what's going on here? Welcome, Julian. Did you have a you are muted, by the way. Did you have a question or did you want to contribute something to this, Julian?
Oh, not really. I got in a bit too late to catch the flow, but I just saw the stream was on and I thought I would jump in and just join the conversation if this is what's going on.
All right.
I just wanted to acknowledge Julian really quickly. The very first conversation I ever had that got put up on YouTube was with Julian and Michael, and we talked about radical orthodoxy, and it was Julian who introduced me to Robert Jensen, and I just wanted to thank him for that.
All right. So
you need to connect Julian and me then, Nate.
Oh, for sure. I will definitely do that. I will put you in touch.
You aren't coming to the conference, are you, Julian?
I didn't even know there was a conference. I'm sort of out of the loop. Where's the conference happening?
Julian, have you been to any conferences?
I have not, which is too bad.
Which is really too bad. So
if you had one in Winnipeg, Manitoba, I'd be up for that.
Well, you never know, Julian. You can organize one. You should have your community organize a conference and invite some of us to it. That's what you should do.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, Hutterite communities aren't exactly an estuary, but cool idea.
All right. And here we have another corner OG, Chad the alcoholic. Chad, do you have a question, or what do you have to say for yourself?
Nothing good to say for myself, for crying out loud. No, but I really want to thank you guys for the conversation. I was listening, and then I took a nap, so I'll have to listen to the rest of it.
Riveting, huh?
No, it was like you guys had such nice voices, but I'm looking forward to coming up to the Northwest Estuary. If it's even a tenth of what Chino was, it should be a blast. So now I'm about ready to get moving around here and do some stuff around the house. We're going to be doing some painting and getting the bathroom ready for the kid. We got a kid on the way. I don't know what I'm going to do with my life.
Yeah.
Oh, congratulations.
Yes,
I hadn't
congratulations to Chad.
Yeah.
Kid on the way. Good for you, man. Good for you.
That's awesome, Chad.
Well, I appreciate. I heard some good stuff, but I can't remember what you guys said. Oh.
I love you, Chad.
Well, I got to ask, actually, Rafe, what did you think about the whole estuary protocol? What was that like for you?
It took a little while to get started, I feel like, and I think that's just inevitable when you have 6 speakers. Like Zoom, it's such an interesting thing because I think it was about an hour in where the conversation really takes off, and then it's incredibly rich and powerful, and I feel like it was amazing. But it's such an interesting thing how long it takes to get a real conversation to happen in a Zoom thing. So it feels like a good protocol. I don't know. It's like 6 people's hard when you're on Zoom.
Yeah. It's also that we haven't had a lot of people here. Like we do it every Sunday morning, and usually 80% of the group are regulars. And what I found is that when you do it regularly, old conversations are then living in the people. And so themes come up, and we get it accelerates. But with a cold group, especially with a group like this, a normal group, you have a lot of people passing, but you got a lot of talkers here, so that's also part of the issue. But yeah, I want to add. Yeah, go ahead, Rafe.
Julian has a question. He sent it in a private chat to me. I suspect he was trying to.
Go for it, Julian.
Yeah, this is more of a big topic that'll be hard to phrase, but I think this sort of connects with what you guys were talking about. But one thing I've been thinking about lately is the whole question around post-liberalism, and then following some of the stuff happening in the U.S. politics with, in the Trump campaign, you have sort of a post-liberal candidate who's part of the ticket, which, I mean, that kind of interests me as someone who's been reading sort of post-liberal thinkers, but who's also an Anabaptist. I just don't know what to sort of think about those developments, because some of the conversations around the corner have been around Christianity versus cultural Christianity, and that's another sort of classic Anabaptist tension where we're sort of all about cultural Christianity isn't real Christianity. We have that kind of Kierkegaardian critique, and I'm sort of just feeling the tension in some of those places, like how can you, like, there are real goods when a country is sort of shaped by the Christian story. I think all of us have to acknowledge that, whether we're Anabaptist or not. So I guess I'm not really looking for pushback from people who aren't pacifists or Anabaptists. I'm wondering for those of you, I mean, Nate, I know you identify as a Christian anarchist. Chris, I think you have pacifist sympathies or something. So I'm wondering if you've felt those tensions, thought about them, processed them. How do you think about it? But just I think part of what I'm saying is I kind of have been listening to some of these post-liberal guys, people like Hauerwas, who is, of course, sort of pacifist. And then there's these other post-liberals who are sort of saying, no, this has to kind of take expression in something like integralism or something, which bridge too far for me as an Anabaptist. But I feel it. Like I understand the language, and so it's gotten me thinking.
All right, anybody want to take that on?
I mean, I'm happy to start here, although this is a long conversation, obviously, Julian. Thank you for the question. I mean, I've been reading Maggie Ross lately, and she makes a difference between magic and prayer in this way. She says magic is an obsession with obtaining a particular outcome, and prayer is openness to whatever future God may bring. And I think a lot of political talk, Christian political talk, including post-liberal talk, is magical in that sense. It's too obsessed about the producing a particular future. I think we have to be. Christianity has. Oh, let me tell a story like this. When we look back over the church's history, we see saints in every possible, imaginable situation, right? That saints can and do emerge anywhere at any time under any conditions. And that tells me that kind of whatever arrangement we make, and I don't think all arrangements are the same. I mean, there are better or worse arrangements. But whatever arrangements we make, they're going to be fraught. They're going to be immediately under threat of the mystery of iniquity. And that in many ways, the better it is, the more at risk we are of doing it too well. Doesn't mean we shouldn't strive to do well, right? To make the arrangement as well as we can. But that all of this for us as Christians has to be done in submission, in yieldedness to God, in openness to whatever future God may bring. And for me, I mean, I'm not an Anabaptist, but yes, I think integralism is magical in that way. It's an attempt to determine a certain future. And I think a lot of the post-liberal project is kind of haunted by nostalgia rather than just genuine memory. And for me as a theologian, as a priest, first and foremost, I don't think as much as riding on the political arrangement as we think rides on it. I think for us as this is where I think our Anabaptist sisters and brothers are reminding us well, like your energy shouldn't go so much into establishing the culture and political arrangement you think most conducive for the faith. Just live it, damn it. Right? Just actually live it and stop trying to set up the conditions in which living it becomes easier for you.
I love it. My knee-jerk response is I just don't know how somebody who's read Ellul and Girard can end up being on a ticket with Donald Trump. I don't know how JD sleeps at night.
My question to maybe add on to this, because I didn't understand post-liberal until you guys started talking about it, is can we avoid can we as a society do we have the capabilities of pulling ourselves up by the bootstraps, or does it have to get a lot worse before it gets better? Because I hear there is a lot of, like, I don't know, it seems like, I'm not being a doomer, I just think like there's a lot of naive conversation about things gonna at some point will get better, but it's like I've rarely seen individuals pull themselves up by the bootstrap without first hitting a wall several times and hard.
Or a floor.
Yeah, exactly. And so I don't see, and I wish it wasn't the case, but is there a way that we can is the word jettison a bottom of sorts?
Jettison a bottom? I don't know what you mean by that, Chad.
avoid it, move past it? Do we have, or will it inevitably come to us finding, like, hitting a wall that is one that is unpredictable? I don't know. I'm sounding like a crazy person. I'm out. I gotta go.
You're not sounding crazy at all, Chad. I think what you're saying, Chad, is a lot of what we've been discussing. Everyone, I loved what you said, Chris, about, the mystery of iniquity. Everyone starts down a road usually thinking, we're gonna, every marriage starts that way. Every project starts that way. And, very quickly you begin to realize all sorts of things. And some of the worst, hardest things to realize are that, yeah, maybe you didn't pick a perfect person and maybe this wasn't a perfect situation, but a great deal of the problem that you're facing is the problem that you face when you look in the mirror. And so, now what do I do when I can't relocate the problems of the world to everyone else besides me? And that's usually, especially Chad. He goes by Chad the alcoholic for a reason. That's of course something that's a deep narrative in his story. Again, especially for Chris, for whom this might be a very strange thing now that we've got all these. Well, what kind of a panel discussion do we have where people come up from the audience and sit with us? But part of why we do this, and we do this regularly, is because these guys down below. Julian isn't just a rando anymore. He's a super smart, extremely well-read welder, dumpster welding, community living, suspender wearing Canadian with a interesting little German accent. So, and Christian, of course, and Joseph, of course. Now I'm gonna give Joseph the next question. No, Christian came in next, and then Joseph. So go ahead, Christian. What say you? Where do you want to? Oh, go ahead, Rafe.
See you, Rafe. Looking forward to seeing you in September.
I wanted to just respond to Julian's question a little bit because, real quick, if I get a chance, I'm not super familiar with post-liberal thinking and what precisely that means in this or how it relates to Anabaptism at all. But for some reason, it started to gestate for me. I was thinking a lot about the earlier conversation we had about constraints. And I think that part of what we have in our political system is that we are propagandized to believe that we have far more power to affect things than we do. And so there's this myth that we all buy into that somehow, it matters who we vote for, right? And it does.
That's the real kayfabe, by the way. That's the kayfabe.
Right? Like there's a handful of states where it matters, but I live in Washington State. It's not going to happen, right? Like we're not going to go red. It's not like, you know what I mean? So there's people feel compelled to try to get everyone to vote and to try to get everyone to talk about it online and all this. And it's like, that's not actually how anything changes. It's really more like an entertainment channel that is used to prevent us from seeing the underlying systems, as far as I can tell. And I'm not, so I think we already live in a post-liberal world. I think we live in a post-democratic democracy, right? Like, I think this is like arguing about how healthy it's like arguing who the next consul is going to be when Augustus is already the imperator, right? I don't know. Maybe I'm being too skeptical here, but I just think that we have less. That the power is so much more in saying, how do I conduct this conversation with my mom? How do I talk to the local people? How do we like there's a demon of polarization that is capturing people on both sides, and it prevents you from being able to have a good conversation at the Thanksgiving table, and it prevents you from being able to like make logical policy at the local level, right? It's like is your vote going to have any determining effect on who the next president is in a country of 370 million? Probably not. But could you be locally organized to have some effect in the local mayor race? And if people who really cared about the mayoral races and the state representatives' offices and all those, like, that's where things would actually start to move up. But the Democratic National Convention and the Republican National Convention and Twitter and CNN, they don't want you to actually focus at that level, because then you could actually do something. They want you to feel like you're participating in some magic ceremony by walking in and pulling a lever. It's not magic. You're not going to do jack shit. So, like, go do something else. That's sorry. Like, I mean, I'm saying vote or not vote, but just don't think that when you vote, you're being allowed to play a guitar solo in front of a crowd of 50,000 people, when what really happened is like dinged your fork against a wall, right?
All right. Thank you, Rafe.
Thanks,
Christian, what say you?
I want to say, yeah, I agree, Rafe. The big trick is that we think that a choice we make once every 4 years defines our whole reality. Like, that's such a sad, and then that's why things get so contentious, because you're trying to place too much value and too much meaning on that and not these other things. It's a very disembodied way to live. One choice every 4 years defines, but it's a trick. So yeah, I wanted to just say, Rafe, I've enjoyed listening to your story, like on John Vervaeke's channel, and recently with Brendan Graham Dempsey and Chris Green. I listened to your randos with Paul. I was kind of and enjoyed both of those. And of course Nate, hi.
Okay,
but I wanted to ask if Chris, if you could clarify a little bit on that, the too good, like getting too good point that you made. I was kind of trying to capture what you were talking about there.
Yeah. So that's my language, but it's Ivan Illich's idea. So let me give, he talks about this on lots of fronts: schooling, medicine, transportation, right? Broadly tool use. Like, one of my favorite examples he gives is the way in which we had the ability to make, in order to travel, right? We make instruments to ease our movement. Think of the chariot. And he makes the case that the bicycle is in some ways like the peak. It's the sweet spot in which we've made something that allows us to travel. It eases travel for us. It speeds it up, but not too much. And it doesn't do damage to nature. It doesn't damage our body, right? So it's kind of a tool that's very useful. It speeds things up, but doesn't press us into a traumatic speed. But we don't stop at making the bicycle. We make more than that. We make the car. We make the train. We make the plane. We make the supersonic plane. We make the spaceship. We continue to make things that are better than the bicycle. They're more sophisticated. They're more powerful. They give us more control over more of the world. And also they deeply damage our humanity. They undo something essential about what it means to be human. And we suffer a kind of trauma, he says, from the speed of our lives. And one of the marks of that trauma is that we no longer fit inside of time. And so the clock becomes more and more important. And the calendar becomes not just something that's there to mark feast days and holy days, but to make sure that tomorrow my life doesn't come apart, because I've got a calendar laid out about what I'm going to do when. There's no natural rhythm to my life. And that, I think, illustrates kind of what runs across the whole spectrum of our experiences now. Another way of thinking about this is, what is the internet, right? And what we've done there is make something that makes possible all kinds of goods, but it's possible to tune those past the sweet spot that's actually good for us and good for others, to a place, turning it up to 11, where suddenly, yes, we can do that, but we pay the price. The world pays the price. My neighbors pay the price. And over the long haul, it begins to undo something essential. Does that clarify? Does that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also think that something like the speed of ideas past what we are able to really take in and process, and then we get into the world of everything's up here, and we're just arguing up here instead of like arguing here even.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly right, Kristen. One of the things that I say a lot, I find myself saying a lot in class with students, is that when you live with ancient and medieval thinkers like I do, you realize that they have much smaller access to knowledge, but much higher understanding, much higher understanding, like
of the good.
Well, yeah, but I mean, even if you think in scientific ways, right? We know so much more now about the scale of the universe than they did. They felt the scale of the universe more forcibly than we do.
Yeah,
right? It touched their bodies and souls. Like I know this about the scale of the universe. It never touches me. Right? I don't feel the scale of the universe. Very, very, very rarely.
Because we look at it in books and watch videos of it.
It's two things. It's to your point. One is the medium in which I learned it on a screen. Right? That's the first thing. The second thing is when I learned it and how I learned it. Like I learned it too fast from somebody who's rattling it off in the middle of a talk in science class with an image up on the board. I didn't learn it from someone who had felt it for 30 years. Right? And then trained me at this precise moment in my life what that means. Right? So, and this is Illich again, right? Our education, like we got too good at it. We delivered literacy at an enormously high level. But what we actually did by the way that we did it is that we made understanding, we flattened understanding dramatically in doing so. So far more people can read, far fewer people can read well.
And you're saying something else about the difference between like understanding an idea to be true versus that person truly embodying the idea and feeling a sense of trueness as a person.
That's exactly right.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm after. And so I think you've got your finger right on the nerve there.
Go ahead, Julian. You're muted. And then Yosef.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on the Illich conversation. I mean, I think Illich is so helpful for the technology conversation because, I mean, what annoys me about some of the ways we're having the technology conversation, and this is how my own thinking has shifted, is that sometimes the ideal is a sort of, can we return to the Garden of Eden and be kind of pure from it all? And that's the sort of, and then you have corresponding errors with sort of political moves that people make. Well, things were better in the Middle Ages. And what I just love about Illich is he describes himself as someone who walks on a waterway. He was growing up in a sort of, I think where did he grow up? He grew up in a traditional sort of tight-knit community, and then sort of saw that being displaced as sort of modernity advanced. And he describes himself as someone who sort of sees both worlds. And I think his biographer and friend Kaylee has said of him, you're never sure if he's like a absolute radical 1960s thinker or if he's a traditionalist Catholic. Like he sort of holds both of those. And then when it comes to talking about technology, he has these sort of really radical critiques. But what I take out of him is he's never saying efficiency, speed, technology is a bad thing, but it's the proportion. Are we having a proportionality of technology that's conducive to what he calls conviviality, to this rich togetherness, or is it fragmenting us and drawing us apart? And he manages to sort of hold those things together in a way that I just find really helpful, to sort of have a foot in both worlds and to try to say on the one hand, but on the other hand, and then to try to make a judgment.
Yeah,
go ahead. Go ahead, Chris. No, go ahead.
I was just going to add, I think that's exactly right. And he manages to keep his balance without simply both sidesing everything. And he's able to name all of this without it seeming like a kind of despair, where you're just resigned to, well, there's nothing we can do about it. Let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Like, he does seem to say there is a way, a sweet spot, a way of finding conviviality. It's worth working.
And that's what I get out of him, is he has this radical critique of modernity. Like, he thinks this is I think he uses the language of the Antichrist. Like, this is the world we've created is uninhabitable for humans. But then he has this vision of you don't seek purity. You don't seek how can I get back to whatever was before. It's how can I create spaces of conviviality? How can I create spaces of joy, of finding humanity, of finding community? And I find that so liberating, because it's not. This is something I felt for myself, like feeling impure for using, social media or for using devices. But the question isn't, can you sort of get rid of it all? The question is, can you find spaces of community and joy within these modern systems?
Yeah. All right, Joseph.
Hi. So something I only heard about half of the talk that you guys were able to have. I had to catch on late. And it was the first half, I'll say that. So the part that wasn't as good, according to Ray. But one, I'm glad that Chris brought up the Star of Redemption. I've actually used it for you probably don't remember this, Paul, but it's been part of my Q&As a couple of times where I've quoted Rosenzweig. So that from that work specifically. So maybe it'd be fun to actually discuss it if you read it. That'd be cool. Chris.
Well, I have to wear a collar, and then I get one for free. So
I know.
I'm a Dutchman. I might just do it, because I still have
will
these
say the
collars that Joseph, the Jew, bought me.
Jacob.
I'm sorry. Everybody's renaming him Jason. So go on, Joseph.
I will say you can get Star of Redemption online for free in archive, Internet Archive, but sometimes it's nice that, I know you like audiobooks, they're having them physically, but it does exist. And for Chris's background, because everyone else here knows me, I am one of the Orthodox Jews in this space. So I come at this from a very different angle. And so it was clear that one of the kind of themes, even though it's face to face, is this whole fancy versus imaginal divide. And it keeps coming up even in these other parts of this conversation. I mean, you just made the same distinction, Chris, in the post-liberal conversation about, is this like actual history, or is this really, this like sentimentality, or what's the word you use?
Nostalgia.
Nostalgia. Thank you. Nostalgia. Right, which seems to be the same thing, right? Like, is this at the same time? So I'm not one who believes in a perfect universal narrative story, and I think there's a lot of multivocality and things. And when you were talking about how, there's like the artist has their fancy, but then there's this like deeper kind of intuitive thing, which is the imaginal. I wonder how really universal in a sense that is at some level. At some level it's going to be, because we're all humans, we all share brains. There's like physical reasons, there's also kind of cultural, material reasons why that might be. But at the same time, I do think that this came up actually in the point Rosenzweig made in that section, right? That the way the Jews view Christianity is going to be very different than the way a Christian's going to view Christianity, right? Like that's not surprising. And I don't think that either of those is necessarily a less imaginally true thing. It's just we're coming at it from very different places, like perspectives, perspectival knowing, whatever you want to use there, right? We approach the problem differently. And one of the other, I want to tie this into this other side of this, which is you guys are talking about fancy and imaginal, but it's supposed to be face to face. And the idea of like what it means to encounter someone's face imaginally versus fancifully. And I think this really ties into, what do you guys call it? Looking through a glass darkly, right? So in Hebrew, and actually in the Greek, right, the phrase glass, you can't tell if it means like a see-through piece of glass or a mirror. And we have the same phrase for the prophets, that they Moses sees through glass clearly, or so not glass, whatever this is, an aspaklaria is really the word. Whether you're using Greek or Hebrew, it's aspaklaria. Whereas the other prophets are said to look to see God darkly through that glass or mirror. But you're encountering yourself in a mirror or glass, whether it's your reflection or not, I think is one of the big questions here. And it is your face, at the same time it is encountering God. So it has both of those elements, right? Maybe a one-way mirror, I don't know. But you can, what it means to see that, and this actually is something I posted to Shari. You just came into the room, perfect. So, right, so what I posted to you yesterday about this, there was a rabbi in the 19th century who was a lot like MacDonald. His name is Nachman of Breslov, and he writes fiction. I mean, he writes fiction in order to deepen people's appreciation of the natural world and of Jewish kind of symbolic worlds and all of the things that MacDonald is doing, except he's doing it in Belarus, you know, but essentially at the same time, they have no knowledge of each other. It's kind of interesting. I've always wanted to compare the two of them. At the same time, he has this set of, he calls his main collection of stories these retellings of stories of ancient days. And essentially, the way he explains it and why he titled it that is it's a ways to re-narrate one's past and one's history and one's past experiences to make them have more meaning, essentially, but like and tie them more deeply into the world, I would say, of the imaginal, and to reorient them into kind of but they were stories you already had, and they weren't necessarily fanciful stories, but they aren't serving you your purpose anymore in a sense, and they aren't functioning for you anymore, right? So you have to retell the story in a new way. That's not to say that whatever you're going to tell as your new story is going to be the final and best story for you, right? And I'm not saying a universal story here, just at you, personal level. It may not be the best personal story. At the same time, there's a recognition that you have to constantly be going through this process, essentially, of, I mean, you can use Jungian like ego death and rebuilding or reintegration, right? There's lots of different parallel, similar traditions around this idea of this kind of retelling one's own story. But I'm hesitant to go into like saying that that's a universal, like, you know, because they're different stories and they're fitted. There's a fittedness to them for different eras in your life, and right, like the story I tell myself as an 80-year-old isn't necessarily more true than when I tell myself now, and that story would not work now for me. Like I mean, I don't know it, but it wouldn't work now for me. I could just as poorly as my 16-year-old story doesn't work for me now. Right. So there's this, I think this idea, and this also comes up a lot with Sam's work that on, I think, about evolution and niches. Like the idea may be that there's an ultimate static, like this is the best story, end of the day, eschatological story. I don't know how useful that is at some level, because in history and time, we're always having to adapt, and our stories have to fit our niche, and it has to be fitting to where we are, and how like our personal evolution and growth is. And I'm gonna stop there. I can talk forever because Paul warned you. We were all talkers.
Was there a question in there you wanted?
Well, so there was to some level, right? I think there's a level of like how useful is like thinking about that. So I think there's two parts. We can go either way. One is like the usefulness of like a bigger, like this is the universal like story that they're all pointing to the same thing, in the same way. I would say so. That's one part of it. The other part, and maybe that's less interesting to some degree. The other part, I think, is like what does it mean to encounter either one's face or God's face, imaginally versus fancifully, and where, you know, where is that kind of, where's that line drawn? Because it's not easy to look in a mirror and to imagine all sorts of things about yourself. I mean, right?
I'll take a first stab at it. To the last question first. I mean, this is what Scripture means by idolatry? Yes, I mean, to see God's face fancifully, I think, is we've crafted something for ourselves to stand in for the God who can't be seen and yet must be. And to the point about the universal story, I think Jews and Christians are agreed on this. The God who is the God of all. Our story has to bear witness to that truth. I think the lie we tell ourselves is that our story is all. I don't think our story can be everything to everyone. I think we can tell stories that are witnesses to the one who is everything to everyone. And it can be really hard to tell that difference, but the difference matters. The difference matters. And I think, of course, the way Christians and Jews tell that story is going to differ, although maybe not in the places we would expect it to differ. But what would be the same is that our story bows its knee at the end. Like the story itself is never the end all be all. And the moment and this is to Julian's point about cultural Christianity, like people who attempt to use Christianity's story as a transcendent force to gather our lives, I think are committing idolatry. Like the Christian story, Christendom and the Christian story does have enormous political use, but it's a violent use. And I think we should eschew it. But that's what your question makes me think.
I'll say, I don't know if anyone else had an answer. I'd love to hear other answers. I'll just say there's something interesting to the first part of what you said, because I think there's this real tension, and it's really interesting that we've had it in this little corner before, around a God of our own understanding being fanciful, and that being like idolatry, versus the God of our own understanding in the way the AA sense of it, right? Like, which is like the only God of my own understanding. Like I can't have any other God beyond like that, right? And those are both gods of my own understanding. There's a real tension between, is that idolatry, or is that like really like this intuitive, imaginal, like personal experience of God? Because you can't, and are those really different things?
I mean, I'm going to say yes, they must be, but they can seem to be the same from outside or inside, depending on if you're in temptation. So in the same way that, you know, if someone's a master art critic and they walk in and see a painting, I'm not going to be able to tell if it's a forgery or not, but they will. Right. And just because it's lost on me that this is a forgery doesn't mean that it's not a forgery. Right. So I think that there is an idolatrous. I mean, if the witness of Scripture is true, then Jews and Christians are bound to say at some point there is a difference between presumption and faith, between the imaginal and the fanciful. However we name that difference, between memory and nostalgia. Like there is good faith with which we approach God, and there is bad faith. And just because I can't tell what's a forgery and what's not doesn't mean it's not a forgery. Ultimately, that's why we have to have the judgment of God.
Well, Joseph, we could go 3-4 hours on this. I was just reading Deuteronomy.
Anytime Joseph talks, it's always something that you can spend 3 or 4 hours.
But I want to give Mark a chance, because Mark actually asked a question early on. I don't know if you want to ask that question, Mark, or if you want to go somewhere else. I'm sure Joseph would be very interested in your question, because it was a great question. But what do you want to say, Mark?
I don't want to interrupt the flow. Could I go after Sherry? Because I got a feeling Sherry probably wants to tie in the Joseph's part. And then if there's still time,
is that what you wanted to do, Sherry, or did you want to go somewhere else?
That would be like you said, Paul, like a 3 or 4 hour conversation. I just jumped on here because I was out on my tractor and I came in and I saw this happening, and I just want to say hello and show my face.
Thank you. Sherry's going to be there. She's going to be my right hand. We're going to be doing this together. Couldn't do it without her.
I'm so eager. I'm so eager to meet. I don't think we've ever met in person yet, have we? Sherry?
I haven't even met my co-criminal partner in crime.
Your real country
partner in crime.
Partner.
Nate. I haven't even met Nate.
Wow. So shoot. Well, I really look forward to that,
excited.
Sherry. Yes.
I'm very excited. I'm so excited to go.
Again, part of everyone. I know Nate has so wanted to pull Chris into this corner to the degree that he could, but part of this is that so many of us now have 5-6 year relationships that we've had only online in this strange mosaic of YouTube channels and Discord conversations and emails. And and you can get a sense, Chris, of the kinds of things we talk about, which is really, it's so, I don't know, as a pastor of a small church, for whom most of these conversations, most of the people in my church wouldn't be terribly interested. It is a lovely, lovely thing. So
I have to say I have met one person who is notorious for making a huge effort
Did
And
Jacob make
long
his way all the way
drive.
up to you?
Jacob came to see me.
Jacob. He
I
does.
spent
he
2
does
nights
this.
here. Actually went to my sister's. I sent him there. I'm like, you got to see my sister's place.
Michael
So-
Michael Satori is dropping by my place next week.
Wow.
He's going
Is
to come on
Jacob,
Saturday.
And
is
I
Jacob
just- I
coming to
saw-
the conference?
No, he's not going to make it. I don't think.
Ah.
I just wanted to just
Jacob, you can't get over yourself.
just
That's
to
why
just
you're
to draw
coming.
lines between Chris and people in this space. This is a book that Joseph recommended to me not too long ago. Israel and the Nations by Eugene Korn, who I'm sure you'll recognize, Chris, because he collaborated with Robert Jensen on several books. So.
Yeah, it's a nerdy
Well, I
little
look
place,
forward to-
nerdy little corner we have here. But
Yeah,
pretty-
and I look forward to talking about imagination and some of and fancy and faces and fairy tales. That's what I'm looking forward to.
all right, beautiful. Thank you, Sherry.
Okay.
All right,
Bye,
Mark,
everybody.
it's all yours.
I did have a question, but I think it was Michael Martin who made the statement about the pagan influence on Christianity. But then Chris Green went off in a direction about, you guys were talking about face to face with God, and it made me think about Exodus. I had to go back and get the exact reference, but Exodus 33, where Moses sees God's hind parts. And I wonder if because this is also going to tie into what you were talking about, deep reading of Scripture and say the medieval scholastics reading deeply compared to our very broad new high-tech world where more of us read, but we don't read as deeply. But with regard to Scripture, I wonder if Scripture is the hind parts. And the face-to-face, or that closest to face-to-face encounter we have, is what, forgive me, Paul, as charismatics see as that baptism of the Holy Spirit.
I'm not anti-charismatic. I don't know where that meme got going, so keep going, Mark.
That's okay. So now Chris has got a caller too. So and that's. I know
Did you
he's.
see our conversation?
I did
Chris
see a
knows a thing or
conversation.
two
That's why I'm
about that
throwing.
world.
That's why I'm pitching this at him instead of my Trinity question. So if Scripture, I know, and the idea of calling Scripture the hind parts, that'll practically get me banned by half the people at my little church because they're biblicists. But I think I don't know if it matters about the education, because there's loads of deep readers. Right now I'm binging on Amy Jill Levine, who's an incredibly deep reader on both Christian and Jewish traditions. I don't know if any. I find it hard to believe that there would be anybody in any age that could compete with her. So my question is what did you say, Paul? I'm sorry.
I asked if you had a question. So you said your question is, keep going.
So now I've got to retrieve it. So is the idea that ultimately what we need is the charismatic experience or the baptism of the Holy Spirit, whether we know it or not, whether we call it that or not. Do we have to even call it the baptism? I'll let you go from there. I put enough out there. Maybe
Blake called it Jesus the Imagination.
Yeah, so I think.
But is that imaginal? Go ahead. Sorry.
This is tricky, right? Any conversation at this depth is, but maybe one way to come at it is what I don't want to do is set up a contrast between the text and the reading of the text and prayer. I think that, to speak Christianly for a moment, I think our understanding of being and knowing, both the order of being and the order of knowing, is Christological all the way down. And it is assuming that in Jesus, the God of Israel has made it so that all good opposites coincide and commune, and all that is opposed to God is overturned and undone. If that's so, then we can't set up contrasts. So what I might say, or at least we can't set up contrasts, except the contrast between the victory of God over that which destroys us, the destruction of the destroyers. So the problem isn't Scripture versus the experience of God. The problem is not that Biblicism has the text but misses the experience of God. The problem is that Biblicism uses Scripture rather than experiencing it as the Word of God. This is too simple and too cute, but you'll get my point. Biblicism tells us that Scripture is a tool in our hands to use as we see fit. But in fact, Scripture is a tool in God's hand to make of us what He will. So Scripture is, I would say, the back parts of God, the hind parts of God. But it's also His face when He's ready for it to be, if we're ready to let it be. So I don't want to reinforce a turn from the text to mystical experience kind of contrast. But I do take your point that there is a way of handling the text that actually is a kind of defense mechanism against God, against prayer. And a test of that is, do I read Scripture to win an argument? I mean, if the pattern of reading Scripture is I open it because I have a question I want answered, and once I have it answered, I close it, then I've not come prayerfully. I've not come to the face of the one who speaks. If I come to the face of the one who speaks, then the opening of Scripture is the beginning of a word I'm not controlling. And if I read in any other way, I'm reading the text I want to see there. Now we're back to the fancy, right? I'm seeing there what I think I need to see to get the outcome I think I want for myself. But to be addressed by the living God means I'm not in any control of what's going to happen now once the text is open. So that's kind of a place to begin. Again, these are tricky differences, but for me, it's not charismatic versus biblical. It's biblicism is a failed project because it's already misunderstood the relationship between the Word, who is God, and these words that the community has given us.
Joseph, you wanted to get in there?
Yeah, I do. I mean, this Trinity question would have been interesting. And in fact, Rosenzweig addresses it in Star of Redemption, and we can talk about that in a different conversation.
Yeah.
It's almost exactly in that language. This is also interesting to me. So I'll say, so one, I find it interesting to translate it as hind parts, but that's, it's really that which is after me or behind me, which is not actually a body part. It's actually a prepositional placement word in the Hebrew grammar. And the way we understand that phrase traditionally is multiple ways to read it, and there's a lot, the multivocality of the text allows for a lot of readings that are useful and overlapping and layered. But the main way we read that is that it's kind of retroactively being able to see God's hand in history and in time. That would include, I would say, the giving of revelations. And specifically, like why it happens in Exodus 33 is really important, right? It's not random. This is a place where God promised Moses that He would talk to him after the Jews were freed. Like God talks to him before they get their freedom in Egypt, at the burning bush, at Mount Horeb. At this, and we can say why, and you can look. You have to look at a couple other places to see why it's the same exact location. But it's this same location that God says, you're going to bring the people. So it's a promise fulfilled, but you can't know beforehand. Right? That's something you only retroactively know, like, hey, God kept His word. Like I can believe in it beforehand. But to know that God actually fulfilled His word, you have to be there afterward and see retroactively God's hand. But it's even more importantly, God had made an agreement with Moses at that spot when Moses struck. That was the first place in time that Moses struck a rock and water came out, that cleft. The same cleft that Moses is hiding in. In fact, the Hebrew is very, very unique to those two scenes. And you can see that Moses goes out from the people 3 days before them to look for water. And after they cross the sea and they fight the Amalekites, he goes out 3 days. And he goes to Horeb, and he strikes the rock, and it brings forth water. And then later, at the point of the golden calf, and after the sin, he's going to go to that same place that God said, "I promised you have a place here with me," and he still has a place here with them, even after the sin. Right? It is a place where God has promised to hold us before the sin, and he still is with us after the sin, fulfilling that promise of holding us there. And there's a lot. I mean, that you don't have to actually go too deep into exegesis to see that. You can actually just look at like the Hebrew, like all the cross references between those 3 or 4 scenes, really, between the burning bush, Sinai, the first time he strikes the rock in the water, not the sinful one, and then after the golden calf. And it really is, right? You can't. Moses wants to know going forward, like, show me that you're always going to be there and that all you always fulfill your word. And God says, I can show you I've fulfilled my word in the past, but you have to trust me that I'm going to fulfill in the future based on what I've done for you before. Right? I think, so to me, like, that's a big part of how we read this. And it is this certain, I don't know. Okay. I could always go on more. I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you. All right. We have 10 minutes left. There was a question that Sam Ewing asked. If someone is feeling suffocated by technology, what should they do? That's Sam's question. It's more on the technology, and we still have your question here, Mark, if you want to bring the Trinity question up. But someone is feeling suffocated by technology. What should they do? What do you think, Julian? Are you muted? No.
Yeah. Let me think.
Well, one of the things that in terms of the technology conversation was interesting because, one of the voices that's at least corner adjacent to us has been Paul Kingsnorth. And Paul Kingsnorth, of course, right now has sort of been this, this one who has raised the alarm about technology. But, I haven't found Paul to have many answers. And I really liked what both Julian and Chris had to say about Illich. And, I think that is so true. And it hits back to what Rafe was talking about in terms of politics, in that, well, we tend to, in this country, project politics to this catastrophe that we suffer from every 4 years. When in fact, that there's so much more rich, true participation in this, that the technological level is simply going to be with us. But we ought to be able to see the tragedy of a child, of a family in a restaurant where dad and mom are on their phones and iPads have been given to the children, and they're sitting there putting food in their mouth when the thing is in front of their face. So, it would seem that, yeah, so I'll just offer that.
If I may just, as a push back a little bit for that, I've been married 33 years. And
I've been married 36. Go on.
I know. You just started earlier. But one of the things my wife and I do, and you guys watch The Bachelor together. My wife and I mean, we all have our little. We'll often sit down and we'll play New York Times puzzle games at a restaurant across the table from each other.
I will not judge you and your wife, Mark. I will not judge you and your wife.
And we chat back and forth. It's the technology has become part of the social interaction. It doesn't dominate it, but it's part of it.
Right. But I think that's the difference between just saying no screens to how do we handle these things.
I don't know if you ever saw my conversation with Paul.
I did.
I talked to Paul.
I did.
And I pushed back at him a fairly significant amount in the conversation. And that's because I just think both Illich and Elul do a much better job of striking a balance than he does.
Yep.
I just think he just takes it a little bit too far. And I ended up calling it the cathedral versus the machine. But the thing I wanted to try to remind Paul of is that the cathedral is also a technology. The cathedral is also our addition to the creation.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Paul has the zeal of a new convert. I think that's a bit
Just two thoughts. I don't know if this is helpful for Sam's question. I think it will be, though. I think the first is, find a rhythm for it rather than all or nothing. Sabbath, like take a day where on that day, it's almost like this idea has lasted for thousands of years for a reason, right? I mean, it might be worth trusting to say, you know what, maybe this is what I need. So that's where I would start. The other is, I do think, and it may just be that Paul has the zeal of a new convert, but I also am a real believer in different vocations. And I think there are some people who are called to be more radical than others for the sake of the whole. And that some of us do need to be teetotalers on all of these issues. We need celibates. We need monks and nuns. We need people who are Luddites and teetotalers. And we need them to live their grace for the community. There's a story of Simeon the Stylite who is not eating, he's doing nothing but praying, and refuses to come even for the Eucharist, refuses to see anyone. He can't be bothered. He's just fasting and praying. And his bishop says to him, that's vanity. These people need you. Get over yourself, right? So we need those kind of extreme persons. And maybe that's who Paul is. Maybe that's who he's called to be. But what he will have to learn, not that I'm his bishop, but what he needs is someone in his life who will say, but don't think that's the answer for everybody. You might need to do that, but offer it as a gift for the whole community. And some of us are just going to have to live with, there are going to be screens in front of us. So for those of us who have to live with that, how do we Sabbath in ways that keep us from being exhausted by it? Those are obvious things, but maybe worth saying anyway.
I have I think one thing, so maybe Kingsnorth has a vocation as someone who's sort of the radical, and not everyone should be like him, and to that sense it's positive. But I also think to the degree that that's the only vision we have, he can end up being contributing to the suffocation, in the sense that if you're living with a vision that says every sort of degree of technology we have is like the garment of skin that's removing us from the garden, and we need to remove these layers to get back. If you're living with that vision, then that's going to increase the suffocation. And then every time you pick up your phone, you're experiencing the guilt. And so what I would say is, don't think, how can I get rid of my technology to get rid of the suffocation? Think about the places in your life where you live out your humanity in a full way. Where are the places you connect with creation? The places you make something, the places you find joy, the places you connect with your humanity, with your animal nature, or what have you, and lean into those areas. So I would say, instead of sort of uprooting all of the technology from your life, lean into those places where you're fully human. And then I just wanted to share something, and I'll try to censor myself as I do so. But one place where I found myself, so I think another area here is the paradox, and Chris, you were referencing this, Illich's paradoxical counterproductivity. I've had real experiences in my life where you think that if you are, for example, texting more, then your level of connection is higher. And I've found places in my life where I've completely stopped texting and just called instead or something. That's literally improved my connection. It's made my relationships deeper. And so there's the paradox there of, sometimes we think this technology is improving a certain area of our life, and if we have more of it, we're more connected or what have you. But actually, toning it down a bit, turning back that dial, without cutting it off completely, can actually increase the goods that the technology is created to create.
Yeah. I mean,
I think y'all can see why we love Julian.
yeah.
Joseph, we've just got another minute here,
Yeah, I
Joseph.
see.
So
I'm going to
for
second
it.
all that real fast. Sabbath, I mean, I'll be off my phone for the next 25 hours starting in 3 hours, right? That's how it works. I also really like Lance had a great, I mean, he does something really nice with his wife. I can't remember what time it is at night, but 9 or 10, whatever it is at night, they turn their phones off and leave them outside their bedroom, which is a different type of like frequency and rhythm. Reimagining the technology, but also retelling the story of how we use the technology, I think is part of what Julian was just saying. I just want to like end, I think, on my last 30 seconds here. Like, you don't go back to the Garden of Eden, right? Like for you guys, the New Jerusalem, for us, like, you know, the third temple, whatever it is, like becomes the Eden, but that's a city, right? That is, or the cathedral, or whatever you want to call it. Like that is a redeemed vision of how to get through all this stuff. And in some ways, like there's almost an eschatological element, which is like, maybe we can't get to that level of redeeming technology ultimately until like in a final age. And in some ways, like one could see the struggle of humanity with this stuff as like, at least a civilization with this stuff, right? As the redeeming of technology through time. And in all these different ways, in setting cases and redeeming it and retelling our stories of it and putting part of it to the side, you know, at times. But ultimately you can't like say, I'm going to reject city building, because then you're never going to have a New Jerusalem.
All right.
Preach.
Well,
that's a good word right there.
Thank you, Chris, for hanging in there and
it was fun.
Getting to meet some of the people here in the corner. There are many of them, and it's amazing how bright and interesting and wonderful so many of these people are, and even to meet them through this technology has been a tremendous blessing and enrichment of my life. And so for those of you who have watched the whole thing, if you want this, I think in a much better way, I'll put the little crawl. It was annoying me. I'll put the little crawl underneath. You can find the Estuary Northwest 2024.com. And are there any tickets left, Nate?
Yeah, so I checked. I actually just checked last week with the cap, and it's really just for the lunch. The dining area has 120 person capacity, so that's what the cap is going to be. Is at 120. We're at around 80 right now. Okay. So there's still room for more folks. The sanctuary will hold 300, but we don't want people to have to go outside to try to find a place to eat. So we're going to keep it capped at what the dining area wants for lunch. I'll be sending out the schedule. I know I got the schedule done. I'll be sending out the schedule to all the people who have registered soon. I just want to make note that lunch is going to be provided both days of the conference. We have a friend of ours, Lisa, owns a Syrian food truck and catering operation, and she's going to cater lunch for us. I'm going to hire her to do it. And so we'll have a falafel and shawarma bar for lunch during the conference.
Wow.
Is there a Discord server for the conference?
There is not a separate Discord server. There is a conference channel on the Grail Country Discord.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you want to talk about it, go to the conference channel on the Grail Country Discord.
And links to the Grail Country Discord can be found.
I'm going to be posting a new Grail Country video probably tomorrow, because this evening I'm talking with JD Lionheart about his book Space God. So I will make sure to put the link in so look for the link in the JD Lionheart video on Space God.
Why don't we also put one in the meetup channel in BLM, maybe?
That makes sense.
For now.
Okay.
That would be great.
All right.
Mark, you have anything else you want to say, Mark? I know
Did you get it? Go ahead.
No, I got a message from you. I'd love to do a randos with you.
Oh.
Nancy is now laid to rest, and I'm getting.
You have so much important stuff to do. You had brought it up, so I sent you an email just to say whenever you can, but whenever.
No, because I'd love to talk with you. Are you coming to the conference, Mark?
I am.
Oh,
I was tempted.
Mark's registered.
I was
Joseph,
tempted.
Are you coming to the conference?
Oh,
Joseph, what are we going to say about a conference?
I know. Wow.
If you actually, I was tempted. If we scheduled a live interview with you, I'll even buy a camera for it. I think That'd be a hoot. I know it's impossible. You're going to be busy and everybody's going to want to talk to you, but it'd be really interesting to do a live back and forth.
Well, who knows? Who knows?
I know it can't plan for that, huh?
Yeah, I'll probably have plenty of camera equipment with me. So if you find the time, I've probably got the equipment. So
I'll make the time for you, Paul. But have you seen Chad's little thing that him and Neil and David, a couple others put together with worldly news tonight?
The latest news segment. You got to watch the latest news.
You got to watch.
Is it on Chad's channel?
Yeah.
It's on Chad's channel. It's a must.
Okay.
It is a must see.
Oh, okay.
And what happened to poor Jacob?
Oh boy.
And what did Joseph? Do you know if it was Jacob? Did Jacob participate ahead of time for this? Was he part of the bit, or did they just make him a victim?
I don't think he knew. I'm pretty sure he and Michael were victims.
Okay.
For
I was totally caught off guard. No one consulted me.
Also, that Peugeot section of that is amazing. Anyway, go watch it.
Priceless.
All right, I will watch it. I will
must see corner TV. Must see.
All right.
Bye,
Joseph,
guys.
You got something you want
Let's
to say?
see you. It's
Okay.
good. It's good.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I'm gonna throw some branding in here. I don't know not sure exactly what I should play, but here's a little bit of dog bark.
Here we go.
Going toward the sunset of time, I'm traveling the highway home, leaving this world of sin far behind. I'm traveling the highway home, traveling the highway home, traveling the highway home. Narrow the way, but thank God I can say I'm traveling the highway home. Well, old Satan said I'd never be traveling the highway home. But when I resisted, he had to flee. I'm traveling the highway home. Yeah, traveling the highway home. Yeah, traveling the highway home. Well, narrow the way, but thank God I can say I'm traveling the highway home. Sometimes the road gets weary and long. I'm traveling the highway home. But in my heart, there's always a song. Traveling the highway home. Traveling the highway home. Traveling the highway home. Though narrow the way, thank God I can say I'm traveling the highway home. Jesus is my highway. Yes. Jesus is my highway home. Jesus is my highway home. Though narrow the way, thank God I can say Jesus is my highway home. Jesus is my highway home. Jesus is my highway home. Though narrow the way, thank God I can say Jesus is my highway way home.
Yay!
Yeah.
Amen. Amen. Internet show. Amen.